All right.
Okay.
The summer conference is back. How about that? Exciting, right? All right. Please help me give a warm GWC Summer Conference welcome to the Provost, Professor of Law, and Dean of the University of Colorado Law School, Lolita Buckner Inniss.
Thank you so much, Sean. And I just want to clarify, I'm not the provost, at least not yet. I am the dean of the University of Colorado Law School, and I am absolutely delighted to be here today to welcome you, those of you who are here in person and those of you who are viewing remotely. I cannot say enough what it means to have you all back in person. And this year, as you may know, marks the 42nd annual convening of the Colorado Law Conference on Natural Resources. This conference, I don't have to tell you, is a signature event, not only for the GWC, but also for the law school and for the entire university. Over the years, this conference has addressed many natural resources issues, and a key focus recently has been water law and policy. Today, we're going to have the opportunity to hear from a variety of experts who are going to address the significant water challenges facing the Colorado River water basin. These are so many that I think we could spend days and days talking about this. However, it is really just clear that we are facing increasing human use, flooding, wildfires, persistent drought, extreme temperatures, so many perils that it is time, as the conference theme notes, to have hard conversations about really complicated issues. And let me say that, like so many difficult conversations, a key is not only to explore the past, but rather to come together to forge a productive, and might I add, a sustainable future. Today, we're going to work to create solutions via a collaborative process. And beyond today, because yes, this conference is not just about the time that we spend together, it's about going on and looking ahead, and with the help of our partners and our friends, to continue not only as thought leaders, but rather as doers in the field. This conference, as I'm sure you know, could not occur without the help of so very, very many people. I think one of the hallmarks of an outstanding institution like the University of Colorado Law School is that we make it look easy. However, there are so many things and so many people that had to happen to bring us together today. I want to first thank the Getchell Wilkinson Center, whose work with our students and the community to address some of the pressing natural resource problems of the day is ongoing. I also want to thank the faculty and the advisory council of the Getchell Wilkinson Center for their commitment to making the center one of the university's, the region's, and might I add, the nation's premier public policy institutions. And of course, I want to offer a tremendous thanks to our IT staff. They truly make these events possible. And speaking of magic, they really do make it seem like it is magic. But I assure you, there is tremendous, tremendous work that goes on to make this happen. Moreover, I want to recognize our conference sponsors, whose support makes these events accessible to our community. The United States Bureau of Reclamation, Confluence West, the Grand Canyon Trust, Hydros Consulting, Moses, Whitmire, Harrison, and Woodruff, Sherman and Howard, Somac, Simmons, and Dunn, Southern Nevada Water Authority, the Utton Center, and the Walton Family Foundation. Thank you all so much for your commitment to the Colorado River and to Colorado law. And to all of you, our guest speakers and our audience alike, thank you all so much for your commitment to a sustainable water future. And finally, I want to say, what about that avalanche? Woohoo! And with that, I want to welcome back GWC Deputy Director Sean LaBar. And again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful conference.
Thank you, Dean Inniss. We truly appreciate you having you here today. I'm not going to pretend like I memorized my welcome this morning. It's kind of last minute role for me, but it is my great honor to welcome you to the 42nd Annual Colorado Law Conference on Natural Resources. It's going to be a hot, smoky, hazy, fiery week here in Colorado, a couple days here in Colorado, so where better to be than here in the beautiful Wolf Law Building. My name is Sean LaBar, but to regulars to the GWC events over the years, you probably know me better as the guy that sits up there, looking stressed out, scrambling around, and trying to look busy. But really, I'm really just usually in the back, eating the snacks. I probably put on 10 pounds in breakfast breads alone, during these conferences. And I was able to do that because I had the pleasure of serving as deputy director under one of the best leaders we have here in Colorado. I'm only here today because of the support and mentorship of Alice Madden. I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to Alice for all she has done for me, Colorado Law, the University of Colorado, our state, and our nation. Thank you, Alice. I would also like to call out two others I think you should know, our GWC Water Fellows, Chelsea Colin and Jaime Garcia. As the first cohort of the GWC Water Fellows program, these two incredible individuals have blazed a trail that will truly be impactful to the future of water in the West. You will get to hear more from them tomorrow, but I would say if you have a role to fill, if you're hiring, their time with us is ending soon. So I would snatch these two up before it's too late because they have a bright future in Western water. I also want to echo the Dean's sentiments and thank our IT staff, particularly Teresa Coberly, who hides out in that back room back there, but really does make these events possible. I also wanted to plug two upcoming events quickly. In October, we'll be hosting the Ruth Wright Distinguished Lecture in Natural Resources, featuring Fawn Sharp, the 23rd president of the National Congress of American Indians. Her knowledge of Western water, public lands, tribal rights should make for an amazing lecture. And I'll be sending more information out on that soon. And as many of you know, in December, the University of Colorado has the honor of hosting the Right Here, Right Now UN Global Climate Summit. There's a flyer available in the atrium for those interested in that, and more information forthcoming through the GWC networks. This will be an incredible opportunity to highlight the important climate work of the United Nations and of CU. So I have two young daughters, Kalei and Ari, and like any parent, I tell them if you find yourself scared or in trouble, look for your helpers, a teacher, police officer, or trusted adult. And this week I found myself in a bit of trouble, a real pickle. So I thought about that advice, and luckily I did not have to look far for my helpers. I was able to call upon two of the best in the business, John Fleck and Doug Kenny. I barely got the request out before they sprung into action, and I could not be more thankful. These trusted adults are going to lead us through the next couple days. The speaker bios are in your programs, and we'll try to keep our intros brief and the conference moving. With that, let's get started. And I would like to welcome from the University of New Mexico School of Law, Professor John Fleck.
Thanks much, and while I'm talking, I'll just take a minute, Jim, and and where's Jeff, could come here and get ready. My name is John Fleck. I am with the Utton Center at the University of New Mexico School of Law. I've gone for a number of years with a career disclaimer that I am a faculty member in the Department of Economics at the University of New Mexico, but I am not an economist. I still hold that title. I also now have a title at a law school, and I have to add the second disclaimer, which I am neither a lawyer nor a legal scholar. So none of this should be construed as either economic or legal advice today. I'm delighted to be here to help host the 42nd annual Getchus Wilkinson Center Conference. Many of you in this audience have been coming here for many, many years. And I've been coming here for more than a decade, and this conference has always been an important focus annually for discussion about how we approach the challenges of management on the Colorado River in the years that I've been coming here. And it has always been a place where we have celebrated the strength and the positive actions that we have seen taken in collaborative governance here in the Colorado River Basin, a sort of top-down / bottom-up process where we have both a strong federal hand, but a very active group of state and local officials crafting solutions from the bottom up. And it's something we've always celebrated here. At dinner last night with several of the panelists, we were discussing this and sort of pondering the question. In the last 2 years, we have seen total reservoir storage in Lake Mead and Lake Powell drop by 8 million acre feet. And we saw earlier this week strong words from the Commissioner of Reclamation, Commissioner Tootin, in testimony before Congress, calling on the states to cut another 2 to 4 million acre feet of water usage in the basin next year. And I got to tell you, when I was sitting in my hotel room in Alamosa, Colorado on the drive up here, watching the testimony on my iPhone, I kind of blanched. That's a lot of water. That is a stunning amount of water. And the commissioner's comments came with a threat, an explanation that the federal government believes it has the authorities to act unilaterally if the collaborative governance system cannot kick into gear and do the work that is needed now, like now, in the next 2 months. And that puts us here in a stunning place on the Colorado River Basin. And I want to suggest that as we start this conference and these conversations, that elephant is like, it's here in the room, it's filling the whole room. And when we planned the conference over the last many months, we had a lot of questions that I think are relevant to that, but suddenly are framed in much sharper focus as we go forward. I think we need to all keep that in mind, that we are dealing with an extraordinarily challenging time. And I'm happy to see in this room, in addition to many people from many walks of Colorado River life, quite a few of the principals who y'all have to fix this, counting on you. We cannot start having this conversation without a conversation about the science, and I would like to introduce our first speaker this morning, Jim Prairie, from the Bureau of Reclamation, one of the leaders of the modeling efforts that will help us understand this. So, Jim.
I'd like to thank John, and I'll just start off by, this morning what I'd like to do is I'd like to walk through kind of the current conditions we're seeing in the basin at the reservoirs. I'd like to then discuss the June 24-month study that was released last night and some of the projections we're seeing. And then I'll dive into a little bit of what we did modeling-wise to provide the information that Commissioner Tootin used during her testimony and provide some insights into why we're coming up with those numbers and what we're seeing. So just starting with the current conditions in the basin. So right now, Lake Powell is 27% full, a storage of 6.64 million acre feet at an elevation of 3,536 feet. Lake Mead is 28% full at a storage of 7.37 million acre feet, an elevation of 1,046. And then our total system storage, this includes all the reservoirs we model in our Colorado River midterm modeling system. They're at 35% full with a storage right now of 20.71 million acre feet. And then last year at this time, the system was about 42% full with a storage of 25 million acre feet. What we know right now is that Lake Powell is going to continue to increase through this month, and then it'll begin dropping again until the next runoff season. And Lake Mead is projected to continue to decrease through September and then increase through March of 2023 before again beginning to decline. And you'll see that in the projections I'll be showing. So to begin, let's look at the snowpack and precipitation we've had since June 13th of 2022 for this year. So what we've had is we've had a 91% precipitation for the 2022 water year to date, but yet we're seeing a runoff of 55% of average for the April to July period. And what that really is telling us is that even though we're having these precipitation, snowfall that's close to normal, we're not seeing runoff close to normal. And that's really driven by the warming that we're seeing in the basin. So that's critical. And that's something we saw last year as well. Last year, we had precipitation of 84%, while we had a runoff of just 37% of average. So again, that warming effect over this runoff period is taking away water that we see in the snowpack. It's really being taken by the soils that are very dry from the temperature that has been increasing over the summers, and that's requiring more water to be given to the soils before it's provided to the river. And that's a key piece that we are fearing is going to continue. Here we're looking at the unregulated inflow into Lake Powell from 1964 to 2022. And then the black line is showing us the long-term 1991 to 2022 average unregulated flow. And what we're seeing is that the June 50th percentile or most probable projection, which is shown in that green bar, that's showing us a inflow of 5.6 million acre feet this year, or 58% of that 91 to 2020 average. The May forecast, the 50th percentile most probable, was 5.9 million acre feet, or 62% of average. So we saw the forecast from May to June continue to drop 370,000 acre feet with a 4% reduction on average. And you can see also that as we look to 2000 to present, really this last 20 years over the drought, we're seeing that there's less flows above that 1991 to 2020 median. We're seeing that a majority of the flows are showing up below and well below that point. This figure is showing Lake Powell and Lake Mead's end of water year storage. And this is beginning in about 1960 when Lake Powell began to fill. And what we can see is the increasing through the 80s as both reservoirs began to fill. At the start of this drought, we actually had in 1999, 92% full, or 47.6 million acre feet sitting in Lakes Powell and Mead. And then we experienced the 5 driest years in record, including 2002, which has yielded the single lowest unregulated inflow into Lake Powell during the observed record. Subsequent inflows combined with voluntary water savings in the lower basin have generally maintained that combined storage through about 2020. But then back-to-back low flows from 2020 to 2021, followed by this year's projection for continued well below average inflows, have again resulted in significant storage reductions of about 11 million acre feet now is where we're heading, or where we've dropped. The June 24 month study, water year 22, combined storage is projected to be 13 or 25% of both reservoirs' capacity. And that's a reduction of 35 million acre feet since 1999 when we began the drought. So here we're looking at what we developed from our Colorado River midterm modeling system. And these are our reservoir projections beginning today, this month, and then going out 2 years. And there's a few things that we can see in these projections. One of them is that with the runoff season kind of near end, we see a lot more the uncertainty reduced significantly through the end of this year, through December 2022. We can see 3 dotted lines. We see a blue dotted line, which represents the 90th percentile flow, or what we call the max probable. The green dotted line represents our 50th percentile flow elevation results, or what we call the most probable. And then the red line represents our 10th percentile flow elevations that are representing our min probable. So really, we're using those forecasts from the CBRC, moving them through our Colorado midterm modeling system, and resulting in these projections of inflow. And we can see that that range of uncertainty is fairly low. There's some critical lines on this plot. The lower line represents our min power pool. It's 3490. That's where below that line, we no longer can produce power at Lake Powell. And then we also see the lower elevation balancing tier of 3525, which is the point where we are potentially releasing more to Lake Mead to balance the two reservoirs. There's already been actions this year to stop that. We're now only going to be releasing 7 million acre feet in an effort to protect that min power pool. Because as you can see, our projections are all showing us heading towards min power pool. So this effort is to stabilize the system as we have time to think about what can we do next, how can we work with our partners to continue to keep this elevation above that min power pool. As you look out to 2023, you can see that that uncertainty then increases again, and we start seeing the possibility of traces dropping again below min power pool, recognizing that we have more that we're going to need to do. So that's a key piece that we're seeing and why we're coming to the table saying that we have this need for additional work. The next figure is looking at Lake Mead. And again, we're looking at the three elevations coming out of the 24-month study in the dotted lines, the max in blue, the most in green, and the min in red. And here we're looking at some new key elevations. We're looking at 1025, which is the point at which we head into level 2 shortage. We're looking at 1050, which is the point when we get into, level 3, 1050, when we look into level 2, and then 1025, which is where we are heading, where we've been living recently, which is looking at level 1, which is what we were at during this year. Looking out to the end of 2022, we're seeing we're solidly within the level 2 shortage range. And a key thing to also see on this plot is what I'm showing are the physical elevations. Right now, you've heard about the concept of operational neutrality, or the fact that even though we're holding back that water at Lake Mead or Lake Powell, we're actually representing the elevations or looking at the elevations at Lake Mead as if that water had been released. And that's how we'll be determining the tiers. Still doing that, we're looking at a level 2 shortage next year at this point. And that's going to require additional mandatory reductions, along with the need for additional reductions beyond that. And then as you look out towards 2023, you see that we have the possibility of being within level 2, and we're seeing both the most and min probable dropping into level 3 shortage conditions. So these are all events leading us to the need that we need to do more to continue to stabilize the system. So just to focus on Lake Powell, since this is the critical elevation we're likely going to hit first. And what we're looking at here is a schematic of Lake Powell to kind of help give a picture of these different elevations. That 3525, that is the elevation we were seeking to protect this year. We did drop below that elevation for a bit. We're now heading below again, but that elevation was there to buffer that min power pole. It's 35 feet above it. And min power pole is that 3490, which is the next point you're seeing in that graphic. And that's the point where below that, we no longer can produce power. We still can release water, and that's down to the next level, 3370. But these critical elevations are all ones we're working to see if we can protect, and recognizing we have projections showing we may drop below those means we need to do more to try and protect the system. There's also importance at 3490, once we've dropped below that. Presently, we're providing water to the city of Page and city of Lecce area, which are two areas that are dependent on that water coming at that elevation. So there actively right now are operations underway to ensure that should we drop below that level and move towards the bypass tubes at 3370, we would still be able to provide water to those two areas. So that's something that's actively being worked on, and this understanding that we need to have contingencies in place should we not be able to protect these levels. So what actions have we taken to date? This is a key part of what we've been doing. So in 2021, the drought response operations agreement releases under an emergency provision were enacted. And with those, we were able to move 161,000 acre feet from both Flaming Gorge and Blue Mesa. There were plans to move additional water from Navajo, but because of conditions at Lake Navajo, we were actually not able to move that additional 10,000 acre feet that was planned. So we just stayed at the 161,000. Beginning in 2022, we could see that we again had that poor inflow season or runoff season. So additional measures were taken, and we needed to first do an adjustment to Powell's monthly release. We actually shifted the monthly releases to release less early in the season, hoping to do more later. That was to prevent us from dropping below the 35-25, so that first level we were working to protect. We were able to protect that level, but then we saw the runoff continue to drop, and two more actions were announced in May. In May, we announced the joint work to reduce releases from Lake Powell to 7 million acre feet, taking 480,000 off of what was the projected release earlier in the year. And then we also enacted the first drought response operations agreement under the normal provisions that allowed us to release 500,000 acre feet from Flaming Gorge to further increase elevations at Lake Powell. And that was, again, seeking to protect that min power pool elevation. So with these two actions, we've been able to this year help to reduce what we've seen as far as the risks of hitting below 35 or 3490. But now we're recognizing that there's going to be need for further action, likely under DROA, the Drought Response Operation Agreement in 2023, and potentially additional actions beyond that, just to ensure that we can maintain the ability for power production and work within Lake Powell. Those actions of 2022 approximately added 1 million acre feet to Lake Powell, and that's equivalent to about 16 feet in elevation for those two actions. So here we're looking at some projections that come from the Colorado Midterm Modeling System Ensemble Streamflow Prediction results. So this is our probabilistic view that we add to our tools to look at what's happening in the future. What I'm showing here is both the May 2022 and the February 2022 results. And the key aspects we want to look at here is in February 2022, we had not yet brought those actions in place that I just spoke about. In May, we had brought those in, and we can see a response in our projections with those actions. At the same time, we are seeing a reduction in the inflows through the forecast from February to May. The forecast dropped about 1.28 million acre feet or 14% between February and May, but those implemented actions allowed us still to see increased elevations at both, well, at Lake Powell, not at Lake Mead. At Lake Powell, we were able to see is a shift in when we were hitting that min power pool. So the blue color is showing you the February projection, while the orange color is showing you the May projection. On the left-hand side, you're seeing Lake Powell's elevation. On the right, Lake Mead. When you look at Lake Powell, you can see that the orange has shifted to later in the months or years, and that's showing the ability of those actions being able to prevent us from dropping to those lower, below min powerful possible projections as soon as we were expecting. It was expected to drop that low this year. We're now been able to push it back into 2023, buying us a bit more time, but not much. When you look at Lake Mead, you're going to see the opposite. At Lake Mead, with that reduced release from Powell, we're now seeing that heading towards 1025 is going to happen quicker. And that, again, is speaking to the need for additional actions. So what I'd like to do now is talk through some of these protection volumes you've heard about, the 0.6 to 4 million acre feet, and the way we came about looking at that. What we did is we worked through two possible hydrology scenarios I'm going to show today. We worked through many more, but these two are actually going to give some context to what we saw across the many traces we had. So these two projections, what we're looking at is average inflow from 2023 to 2026 to Lake Powell is, and I'm going to check. We're actually able to see that at Lake Powell, if we had 56% of normal over that period in the first trace, that would represent if next year was like 2022, followed by 3 years that we've seen in the past. And we chose 2002, 2003, 2004. And this was trying to put into context what it would look like should we experience those flows over the next 4 years. And I'll be referring to that as the new normal 2 is what we're calling it. And that's because these scenarios are built of a series of traces that we ran through the color river simulation system that allowed us to look at a stress test type hydrology, 1981 through 2020, and then through 2019, and then also a new normal looking at 2000 through 2018, and be able to understand some of that information. So here, we also looked at a second trace, the average 4-year inflow as 67% of normal. And this would represent next year like 2021, which was 46% of normal, followed by a wet year and then 2 dry years. And the idea here is to show that even with these wet years, this one wet year, these 2 dry years are really going to pull us back in the same position we're in right now. And this one we refer to as new normal 2019. And to provide some context, the 2001 through 24 period, that provided an average flow of 56% of the 91 to 2020 period. And the 1918 to 2021 was 73%. And then 2000 to 2021 was 88%. So here we're looking at that first hydrology, and we're looking at the elevation, the combined storage between Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And some key lines on here are the combined storage at 2 protection levels, 3525 and 1020, which is 11.59. That's the upper dotted line. And then the combined storage at 3,500 and 1,000, 3,500 at Powell, 1,000 at Lake Mead, which is 8.8 million acre feet. That's the second dotted line. And then we're seeing that given that inflow trace, the first one, which is really a representation of close to the worst 4 years we experienced from 2000 through 2001 through 2004, we're seeing that we continue to drop off significantly in storage. And we start arriving by 2026 at combined storages of Lake Mead and Lake Powell of about 1 million acre feet. So those are the conditions we're seeing that are asking for the need to do a lot more. We can look at this individually by each reservoir. So here we're now looking at Powell on the left-hand side, Mead on the right-hand side. And in blue, we're looking at that min power pool level. And in red at the bottom, we're looking at the dead pool at 3370. The min power pool, again, 3490. And then we're looking at that same trace, but now broken it out for Powell. And we can see that under that trace, we are dropping below the min power pool, coming above it, but then dropping below again. So more actions needed beyond just what we've been able to do. At Mead, we're seeing even more dire consequences. We're seeing the min power pool at Mead at 950, that's in blue. The dead pool at Mead, 895 in red. And we're seeing by the end of this period, 4-year period, we are heading right down towards that dead pool level and well below the min power pool level. And that's at an average inflow of 56 million, 56% of the 2000 to 2021 average. Sorry, 1991 to 2020 average. If we bring the second trace in, now we're looking at that scenario where we see 46% of inflow into Powell. The first year, we see a well above normal, 123%. In the second year, that's about the highest we've seen really over the last 20 years. And then we're seeing below normals of 70 and 67%. So still better than what we're experiencing this year. So our average of 76% inflow to Powell. And we can see that orange line representing the combined storage. And yet again, we're falling below both those levels that we'd like to protect. The 3525 at Lake Mead or 1020, at Lake Powell or 1020 at Lake Mead. And the 3500 at Lake Powell and the 1000 at Lake Mead. If we break this up now again and look at Powell, we can see that under this new trace, the orange one, even with this increased flow in 2024 and an increased average of 76% over the 4 years, higher than we're getting this year, we still are seeing ourselves dropping well below the min power pool. And then similarly at Lake Mead, we're dropping not below min power pool, but we still are dropping below those protection volumes we'd like to keep at Lake Mead of 1020 and 1000. So let's talk about those protection volumes that we want to look at. So the analysis that we're doing here is what we're working to do is quantify that volume of additional water needed to maintain and absolutely protect these specific elevations at Lake Powell and Lake Mead for the next 4 years, from 2023 to 2026. And this is based on plausible hydrologic futures. So you saw 2 of those example futures. So I want to make note also that we've not made a decision regarding the appropriate protection levels, so we're analyzing those 2 volumes that I've been speaking about. The first volume is really what's necessary to protect the DCP critical elevations of 3525 and 1020, and the second volume to protect those lower levels of 3500 and 1000, which are really more dire levels if we're only protecting those. And those are these 2 levels here that we're going to be working to look at these protection levels at. So the approach we took, we're working to quantify the volume of water that's necessary to keep Powell and Mead at these elevations. And we're doing this by projecting this protection volume into the system above Powell and Mead. And we're doing this without assigning it to any user. So the idea is not to figure out who takes this, it's to look at what is needed to just protect the combined Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And this work is in addition to what's being done presently with the work of the lower basin shortage, the drought contingency planning contributions, and both minute 2-3 reductions in shortage volumes. And all the work under those right now would lead to a conservation of 1.375 million acre feet when Mead is below 1025. So we're looking on top of that 1.375 million acre feet. We're doing this under 3 hydrologic futures. To quantify this, we're looking at that stress test I've spoken about. This is resampling the historic record from 1988 to 2019. We're resampling the historical record from 2000 to 2019. And then we're working with climate change-based hydrology to look at some more hydrologies beyond just what we've seen in the observed record, but are still plausible given the science we're seeing right now. And they also bring in the impacts of the increased warming we're seeing, which aren't necessarily brought in through these other 2 scenarios. Those scenarios have the warming to date, but that warming is on a trend that's continuing to increase. So the initial conditions, December 31st, 2020, also incorporate this year's drought response operation agreements, 500,000 that came from Flaming Gorge, along with the reduction in Powell's release to 7 million acre feet. So those are included in this model run. So using this model run, what we were able to do is develop the information I'm showing in this table. And you've seen pieces of this, so I'll discuss this in a little more detail. What we're seeing here is we're looking at the 2023 through 2026 average Lake Powell inflow. So this is all based on inflow into Lake Powell. This is what the inflow that would be observed as we modeled. And it's looking at comparing that to the percentage of 1991 to 2020 average flow, which is 9.46 million acre feet. And then moving down, we're looking at across different percentile reductions of that average flow. The first reduction is less than 95%, or sorry, greater than 95%, which would be 8.99 million acre feet of inflow. On average, the next one is about 87.5% or 8.28 million acre feet of inflow. The next one on average is about 71.5% or 6.76 million acre feet. And then the next category is about, on average, 56.6% or 5.34 million acre feet. And then the less than 50 is 4.73 million acre feet. And again, for context, the 2000 to 21 was 8.23, and then 2022 right now is projected to be about 6 million acre feet. So just to give you a sense of where we sit. What's being shown in the center column then is your average Lake Powell end of water year elevation without any action. And we're looking at each year, 2023, 2024, 25, and 26. And we're looking at that average elevation that came out of these modeling runs. And then what we're highlighting is when we are vulnerable to dropping below those protection levels we were talking about. The protection level of between 3525 and 3500 at Lake Powell, here we're focusing on Powell, or dropping below 3500 in pink, the other one in orange. And what we can see is at the end of the water year, we see vulnerabilities once we are getting below between 80 and 95% of that 91 to 2020 average. You'll note on the right-hand side, we're talking about that average volume needed to protect. We're doing that as a combined. We have not split that between each reservoirs, but we're looking at the two different protection volumes, the higher volume on the left, the lower volume on the right. And you'll note that we're seeking or noting a need for protection values beginning at that greater than 95% of about 600,000 under the higher protection levels and about 200,000 on the lower. So even though you're not seeing a vulnerability in that end of year, we do this analysis and look for these injections month by month, since we want to maintain that power production each month. So even though we don't have the end of the year, the vulnerability, there are months between, we are seeing a need for protection volumes to maintain those protection level elevations. So that's the kind of key take home that we were taking. And as you move down to the levels that we're seeing, so this year, again, we have an inflow of about 6 million acre feet. That's about the 71. So that's coming in between the 50 and 63%. And we're seeing needs for protection volumes of about 3.5 to get million acre feet to protect at the higher protection level and 2.7 million acre feet. And these numbers are annual numbers needed each year over that 4-year period. They are not a combination of the 4-year. So that's really the urgency that we are seeing and working to convey for everyone. We can look at similar results for Lake Mead. So at Lake Mead, we have the same percents on the far left. We have a different set of elevations that are for end of year for Lake Mead. And we see those end of year vulnerabilities beginning a bit later when we're looking at December, but yet they are kicking in that need for the combined protection as early as just below the average, because in any given month, we are seeing a possibility of dropping below those protection levels, be it the higher protection level of 3525 at Lake Powell, 1020 at Lake Mead, or 3500 at Lake Powell, 1,000 at Lake Mead. So some of the summary that we want to bring about is we don't know what the run-up's going to be next year. It's likely to be below average again. There's indicators towards that. And if it's below average, we're going to have a need to do additional protection. we will not be able to sustain the levels we'd like to sustain and the production of power that we'd like to sustain at the current reductions we have in the system. If 2023 inflow is like 2022, like this year, Lake Powell and Lake Mead together are going to need at least an additional 2.5 million acre feet above and beyond all the work we're doing, even if we drop below that 1025 at Lake Mead, because that 1.3 million acre feet is still not enough to keep our protection levels that we're looking for. And then each year that we fail to provide this additional protection, we're just going to need to add more protection to maintain these levels in subsequent years above and beyond these levels that we're talking about right now. So really the need for action right away is immediate. You heard that from Commissioner Tootin. We're really looking for these next 2 months to collaboratively work together and find a way to bring these types of levels, protection levels, to a reality that we can keep. And I will stop with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. And as if the near term is not bad enough, we now have Jeff Lukas. Sean, do you want to? We now have Jeff Lukas bios are in the program. I'm not going to take a lot of time with that. We have now Jeff Lukas to talk about what the long-term has in store for us.
Is that supposed to be auto playing? Good.
Wow. So, obviously what I was looking at to put together my presentation for the long term is no less sobering than what Jim just showed, but I'm still, I need like a 5-minute break to kind of absorb that. And also realize that even though, I've shared the podium with Jim many times in the past, kind of this short-term, long-term duo, sometimes he does the long-term. We seldom explicitly coordinate our talks, but we end up cohering really well. And I think that just shows the influence that Jim's had on me over the years in my thinking. We started working on long-term information for long-term outlooks back in maybe 2004, ahead of the 2007 interim guidelines. And here we are, still at it, but with the problems of the basin, of course, have sharpened considerably. So thanks again to John and Doug and Alice and Sean for the opportunity to speak to you today. And if I appear at all upbeat, that's because of my great pleasure at seeing all of you here in the room, in person, the Colorado River community, my colleagues, friends, and many more of you online. And so what I hope to do today is complement what Jim has just done, but thinking about the longer term, 5 to 50 years, and mostly I'll be looking at mid-century, which is roughly 2040 to 2070, so a period centered on about 2055. So, just a little more than 30 years from now, which now seems really short. And looking at a number of different kinds of information to give us some insights on that period, and also revisiting some assessments or long-term outlooks that I provided just a few years ago through the Colorado River Climate and Hydrology State of the Science report. So we'll start there with that report. Many of you have seen it. Fewer of you have read the whole thing. It's over 500 pages. If you need reading material or a sleep aid, print out the whole thing, put it on your nightstand, use it as a nightstand, but it does have a lot of good information. I'm not sure Anyway, so Liz Payton and I, under the banner of Western Water Assessment and an all-star author team, put this report together and released it in April 2020. And so much credit goes to the consortium of water basin agencies that will not stay appearing on the slide, but over on the right here, probably virtually all of you are represented in the room or online. And this group, acting under the umbrella of the Colorado River Climate and Hydrology Working Group, saw the need for the report, funded it, and gave us a lot of critical and important input along the way. So thanks again for that. And so finally to this slide, the last section of the report, volume 4, is devoted to long-term outlooks, where we describe approaches to applying these 3 primary sources of guidance to the long-term future. The observed historical hydrology, tree ring paleohydrology, and what we kind of awkwardly called climate change informed hydrology. We're really talking about future hydrologies based on global climate models. So what we presented in the report in 2020 is again, my starting point today, but my thinking about long-term outlooks in general and these sources of information has evolved quite a bit in the last 2 years. And not so much because of new science, new findings per se, but because the facts on the ground have changed a lot. Certainly the system state has changed a lot. And it's such a way to expose weaknesses, you could say, of past approaches. So I'm going to reverse the order of volume 4, which steps through chapter 9, 10, 11, ending with the climate models, and start with those. Because this is an area in which, yes, there's been a lot of new science, or at least data, in the last few years, but that turns out to be not as consequential as how we interpret the science that we already had in 2020. All right, so global climate models, GCMs, now increasingly called Earth System Models, or ESMs, sophisticated supercomputer-based tools used to diagnose past climate changes and also provide plausible climate futures. And what we end up seeing in any particular simulation from a single climate model depends first on the specific and uncertain assumptions about greenhouse gas emissions and concentrations that are used to drive that model and that simulation or projection. And then second, how our physical understanding of the climate system, including the uncertainties, is encoded in that particular model. And each modeling group has a slightly different way of approaching those areas in which we have uncertainties. What are the feedbacks from different types of clouds at different levels, at different latitudes, and so forth. Even though the models do share an awful lot of information, mostly in the form of physics equations that govern the movement of momentum and energy and mass from one grid cell in the model to another. In addition to simulating what we call the forced response to anthropogenic change, the increase in greenhouse gas emissions and concentrations, climate models also simulate the climate's natural or internal variability, at all global down to regional scales. And so that does complicate our interpretation of what we're seeing in the models, especially for precipitation. So CMIP, some of you have heard this term and others probably have not. So it's a standardized or semi-organized roundup of climate models that happens about every 7 years. CMIP stands for the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. It's sort of led and by the climate modeling community with help from other experts across, you could say, the global climate change domain. And CMIP imposes some order on what would otherwise be a completely unusable flow of terabytes of data generated by the dozens of modeling groups worldwide. As it is, it's barely usable, but it could be a lot worse. And in each CMIP, those modeling groups agree to run a series of standardized simulations using several prescribed greenhouse gas emission scenarios over the same time periods. The CMIPs are deliberately constructed in time so that the data feed nicely into the forthcoming set of reports from the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But that same model output also gets used over the next several years in thousands, literally thousands, of other reports and analyses down to the regional and local scale as well, including the Basin study in 2012 and our 2020 report. And with each CMIP, more modeling groups and models participate. And in general, the models do get objectively better overall with each generation. Higher spatial resolution, a little more fine-tuned parameters of the things we're still uncertain about, and greater fidelity to the observed climate patterns. But there are no requirements with respect to model quality to participate in CMIP. And so any modeling group that could produce the prescribed simulations gets to join in. So here's what we showed in Chapter 11. These are sort of the main figures, you could say, of Chapter 11 of the 2020 State of the Science report. 32 different CMIP 5 projections, so not the absolutely newest runs, but the ones that were the most recent runs available in 2019, 2020. Under 2 different emission scenarios, RCP 4.5 and 8.5, and that have been later downscaled using the LOCA method developed by David Pierce and others at Scripps to provide more localized information. And I know at this distance, you're not going to be able to read numbers. If you were here in the room, maybe you can online, but that's okay, because this is more conceptual at this point. We'll dig much deeper into numbers in a little bit. So here's RCP 4.5. First, we have projected temperatures, and they go up quite a bit relative to late 20th century temperatures. By mid-century, you're maybe 3 to 6 degrees warmer. And that spread reflects uncertainty in how the climate system will actually respond to that increment of greenhouse gases, which is the same across all these model runs. So it's really showing how the different modeling groups and thus the different models, are encoding the knowledge about the climate system. And then precipitation, and here things get more interesting. And for the Upper Basin, it shows precipitation kind of all over the map in terms of whether there will be more or less over the 21st century. Some models going higher, some models going lower, some models staying about the same. And you see a lot more wiggles in precipitation, even though these are 30-year running averages. So you're really dampening down that year-to-year variability using a 30-year smooth, but it still shows up. We see that in the historic record as well. Wiggles, that reflect, again, that natural or internal variability of the system. Do we have a cluster of El Nino events over one 30-year period versus another, things like that. So we do see in the majority of these projections under RCP 4.5, increasing precipitation overall at mid-century and across the 21st century. And the median for mid-century is about 2 to 3% higher than the late 20th century baseline. And then when you effectively run these temperature and precipitation projections together, through a hydrologic model, in this case, the Vic hydrologic model, which you're using kind of standalone. It inputs the temperature, the future temperature and precipitation runs or traces, and then spits out corresponding stream flow traces. And that's seen here. These stream flow projections show, you could say, the additive effects of the warming, which, as Jim describes, tends to diminish stream flow, snowpack, stream flow, soil moisture, pretty much dries out the whole surface hydrology, but it tends to reduce flow by about 5% per degree Fahrenheit. That number has changed around over the last several years as more studies, analyses have been done, but about 5% per degree Fahrenheit. So most of the 32 stream flow futures here show lower flow, but the tendency across these climate models to show slightly higher precipitation in the upper basin is partially offsetting the effects of warming. So we're actually not seeing that full 5% per, I mean, it's in there, but then precipitation, which is going up in most of these runs, is bringing the stream flow back up. And then the corresponding RCP 8.5, the much higher emissions and concentrations of greenhouse gases, and very clear in temperature, we're warming a lot more in the upper basin and across the world. Under RCP 8.5, we see about 4 to 8 degrees of warming by mid-century, and far more than RCP 4.5 in late century. The precipitation projections are again kind of scattered, but maybe with a slightly greater tendency towards wetter conditions than in RCP 4.5. And that's just a consequence of how the models expect, you could say, the circulation, the atmospheric circulation is sort of reorganized as the planet warms up more. And also that more water, when we do have storms, more water can be held in a warmer atmosphere. So we've got some interesting and sometimes offsetting effects going on in precipitation. So again, when we look at the streamflow projections, you look at temperature and you think it would go down a lot more in streamflow, given the much warmer temperatures in RCP 8.5. But with that stronger tendency towards slightly wetter conditions, the stream flows are not tipped as downward as you might expect, given that very significant warming, and more offset from increased precipitation overall. So here is what it looks like when you put the stream flow projections onto a single plot. And the box plots at right, one more, individually are summarizing the 32 projections each from under RCP 4.5 and 8.5. You can see at least the medians, the darker lines, the red and blue lines, they're pretty similar, through at mid-century and through the 21st century. The RCP 8.5 futures are a little drier overall, but there's a lot of overlap with the futures under RCP 4.5. Presenting them this way implies that the two emission scenarios are equally likely and that the 64 projections are equally likely. And these have been pretty standard assumptions over the years for CMIP climate model analyses like these, including those in the Basin study and in the 2020 report. So the traditional take-homes from this combined everyone is equal ensemble of streamflow futures is that about 2/3 of the projections show flows below 15 million acre feet at mid-century on a 30-year basis. And 9 out of 10 show between, here's your brackets, between 11.5 and 16.7 million acre feet. I look at that and first I say, wow, that sounds pretty darn good about now. To have these opportunities to be above 15 million acre feet. And which shows just how bad things have gotten on the system. But with the benefit of hindsight and 2 years of additional thinking and discussions, I can say this: while this plot may be an accurate summary of an important data set, as a long-term outlook, it's not very helpful. And actually quite misleading. And I think it really understates the risk to the system in the longer term. So I'm going to spend the next little while sort of dismantling this in a way, which feels like a weird confession of malfeasance or something, given that we just presented it at no small cost as part of the 2020 report. But this is how things progress, taking in new sources of information, even if it's not coming from the climate modeling community per se. So I've brought the Microsoft clip art confused guy out of retirement, and can we help him? Can we help all of us better interpret and apply this set of futures for basin hydrology? And the first item on my agenda here is maybe unexpected, though we did discuss it in the 2020 report. And that is, what if we make some judgments about the likelihood of the emission scenarios? Now, back in 2013 or so, if you look at that thick black line, in 2013, it was reasonable to look at that slope of the year-by-year anthropogenic CO2 emissions. So this is responsible for 70% of the total push on the climate system. You know, methane and other CFCs are doing the rest. And you could assume we were on track for the highest scenarios, RCP 8.5, the dotted red line, and then the solid red line, which is the corresponding CMIP 6 scenario, which also has 8.5 in the names. You know, they're closely related. But since then, finally, haltingly, the decarbonization of the global economy has gotten underway. The emissions curve has flattened, and well before the temporary dip caused by COVID. And just as critically, the Paris Agreement and other subsequent international commitments point to future emissions that are much more consistent with the RCP 4.5 scenario than to 8.5 scenarios. 8.5 has been criticized in the literature in the last several years for having what seem like really unrealistic assumptions about a massive return to coal burning globally. It's hard to get to 8.5 given what we've seen over the last 10 years. Now, we could get some real surprises with the carbon cycle, massive methane emissions from the Arctic, so forth. So it's not as though the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are completely off the table, but in terms of representing anthropogenic emissions, 4.5 is looking quite a bit more likely than 8.5 at this point. And then there are other scenarios I'm not showing here, especially associated with CMIP 6 that are kind of in between, and we could always, as hard as it will be, go lower than 4.5 over the next several decades. So for the purposes of what I'm showing today, I'm going to ignore the 8.5 results, remove it from further analysis, even though it really doesn't make a big difference for stream flow in the upper basin, as we saw in those previous slides. That additional warming implicit in 8.5 scenarios does make a big difference for things like snowpack, snowmelt, and stream flow timing, summer and fall moisture, but not for stream flow itself, where precipitation change has a bigger sway. I think we just generally need to get out of the habit as seeing the 8.5 scenarios as equally likely compared to other lower emission scenarios, let alone being the most likely scenario or the only one we look at. Well, so what about those shiny new CMIP 6 projections that started trickling out a few years ago, were featured in the first IPCC 6th assessment reports that came out last year? Well, first of all, there was kind of a quirk with the models. This was highlighted in the research community starting in 2019, that about a third of the models were kind of running hotter for a given increment of greenhouse gas emissions than the CMIP 5 models, and hotter than recent temperatures and other evidence of what the true response of the climate system should look like. And so the authors decided that they needed to correct for this, which is the first time that the IPCC reports have done an explicit correction to the CMIP ensemble as it's come out from the modeling community. Usually they just take it as is, analyze it, show us the results in the reports. But here they said, we need to correct for this unrealistic warming. And this unrealistic warming of global scale manifests regionally as well. And so you need to correct for that. And once you do, CMIP 6 is overall ever so slightly warmer than CMIP 5, but also slightly wetter. So while we don't have streamflow traces for the Colorado River Basin or other basins driven by the CMIP 6 scenarios yet, my strong inference is that they will look very similar to CMIP 5. So I'll just keep rolling with CMIP 5. All right, so we've been wandering around in the CMIP wilderness for several slides, and returning to the guidance in the 2020 report, let's check in with that observed hydrology we were just looking at and sobered by, and see if that can help us give us a better grip on what the climate models are telling us. And so since 2019, we've added 3 water years, 2020, 2021, and then I'm giving a provisional estimate for 2022 that are the worst since 2002 to 2004 is a 3-year period, and second worst on record. So this is, further mired us in this longer 20+ year period of substantially lower flows than in the previous century. And I need to point out, when I'm showing numbers for flow for the upper basin, I'm showing naturalized stream flows at Lee's Ferry. Jim was showing undepleted water year flows, inflows to Powell. Those track really well, but there's about a 4 million acre foot difference between them, and that represents the whole of upper basin depletions. So when you see these numbers, you can just subtract 4 million acre feet to get to the corresponding numbers that Jim was showing. Sorry for making you do that math. So what we see is in the last 23 years, we're about 17% below the longer term average for upper basin flow. And it's maybe tempting to assume that because climate change is occurring and will continue, that we should use that minus 17% as a starting point and kind of ratchet down from there. But we need to try to diagnose why flow has been so much lower during the past 20 to 30 years. And so if you look at upper basin water year precipitation, which by itself statistically explains about 70% of the variation from year to year in runoff at Lee's Ferry, you see that the recent period of lower flows has also been a period of lower precipitation. And as a rough rule of thumb, a 1% change in basin precipitation is associated with a 2% change in stream flow. And that just has to do with the way that precipitation gets translated through the hydrologic system into stream flow. But 1% precip means 2% flow. That implies that lower precipitation has been responsible for maybe more than half of the reduced flow from 2000 to 2022. There have been some more formal hydrologic attribution studies published in the last several years. And the emerging, still rough consensus from those is that it's about half of the reduced flow since 2000 is due to this lower precipitation, which leaves the other half to temperatures, as we know, have been going up significantly in the upper basin, across the West, the US, North America, and globally over the last 40 years or so. Here I'm comparing the post-2000 23-year average to a longer baseline that includes that recent period. So you get a warming of about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you use that 5% per degree warming rule of thumb I shared earlier, you get about 9% of stream flow loss just from the warming alone, which actually coheres with what the more sophisticated attribution analyses are showing. So if you have been managing to keep track, and no judgment if you haven't, you may have noticed that while more than half of the climate models show overall increasing precipitation over the 21st century, precipitation in actuality has declined over the first 2 decades of the new century. Now, again, the climate models aren't trying to replicate actual historical sequences of precipitation. They are just trying to replicate the modes and statistics of variability that we see in our observations. So the fact that most of the models don't show a dry period in the 2000s doesn't invalidate what they show for the rest of the century. But the longer that the actual dry period persists, the more plausible a sizable increase by mid-century or across the 21st century becomes. And then we also have some attribution studies, including some of the ones I mentioned earlier, looking at what has caused the runoff change in the early 21st century in the basin. And they suggest the dry period since 2000 does have an anthropogenic component. So there is evidence that what we're doing to the atmosphere is not only changing temperatures, which impacts flow, we're pushing precipitation downward. Now, there's a lot of noise variability on precipitation, but this suggests that further climate change will tip the basin towards less precipitation on average rather than more. So I was emboldened to try something out, and that was, oh, I've lost a slide here. Okay, to take out those projections of the 32 in which precipitation, the models are telling us, is going to increase by more than 5%. So the higher end, that you could say optimistic about precipitation, going to compensate a lot for the warming. Those model runs, I'm taking them out. And doing that, I took out 14 of the 32 model runs. And then I said, okay, following what the IPCC did with respect to temperature change, what if I screen out the projections that show an early 21st century warming for the basin that's much higher or lower than observed? And here I'm just really taking out the outliers. So another 3 models came out. So here's our full 32 projections again. So I've showed this before several times. Here's what it looks like when you screen down to 14 based on kind of this knowledge of what we've actually seen so far in the 21st century. That's a much, much different picture of what to expect in the next several decades and beyond in the Colorado River Basin. And it seems, sort of like mentally, psychologically, a little more consistent with certain other sources of information. I think also what we feel, and we should pay attention to that feeling, because we're using this information not just to, let's explore things. These are interesting issues. No, this is serious stuff, and the system is in a serious state. And we want to use guidance about the future that is not going to lead us into another dead end or further surprises. So same 14 projections here shown individually as bar plots. And I'm looking at the lowest 23-year period ending in mid-century and showing that, nearly all of them have low flow periods, the length of 2000 to 2022, and quite a bit lower flows. But, the observed 2000 to 2022 is a pretty bad looking period unto itself. All right, quickly, paleohydrology. Here's the triggering reconstruction of Lee's Ferry stream flow. I'm using a slight variant on the Miko et al. 2007 reconstruction that appeared in the Basin study analyses and later reports. And here we've got a lowest 30 years of 12 million acre feet, which is pretty close to the mean or the median 12.3 million acre feet here. So if you take a 1,200 year sample of basically the worst that natural variability can bring to us, it looks about what the climate models say is an average, at least these 14 models say is an average mid-21st century scenario. So then finally, some kind of synthesis. And I put this together yesterday. So this is not in any way completely thought through. It's more of a thought exercise, really, an experiment. So here we have the observed hydrology. I'm looking at 30-year averages, the range of 30-year averages, thinking that's a nice sample. And of course, we'd have to populate those averages with individual years to run them through things like CRSS. Here's the observations. We really only want to pay attention to that lowest period. I think that's the only 30-year period, the most recent one, that tell us anything about the future or that we want to bring forward to provide guidance about the future. Here's the paleo, looking back 1,200 years. Again, I think we only want to bring forward that lowest as being something that's very physically plausible. It happened before. Let's keep it in our field of view. Here is my screened 14 CMIP5 LOCA projections. Now, it's a really skewed distribution because there are a few kind of higher end ones. I'm more interested in that median, which is a little over 12 million acre feet. Then I pulled in some friends. You could say I needed some backup, needed some sanity checks. We've got some warming only scenarios. These are based on climate models, CMIP3 and CMIP5. They ignore the precipitation, so they get out of that problem completely and are just looking at the impact of warming associated with those climate model projections. So one from Udall and Overpeck 2017, one from, I think, still unpublished Reclamation and others analysis. And those look really similar. And medians, again, 12 million acre feet or so, but low ends down to closer to 11. And so then my very subjective composite of that information is running from 11 to 13.5 million acre feet natural flow at Lee's Ferry, which interestingly is right about 2 to 4 million acre feet below. there's the 2 to 4 million acre foot reduction, you might say. So what the commissioner is telling us needs to be reduced immediately, that is kind of where we might want to be mid-century, is to keep those sorts of reductions going. So final thoughts that I think we can be more deliberate and selective in choosing which data to use for long-term outlooks. We're not stuck with what the arbitrary, you could say ad hoc ensemble that comes from the climate model community. And given the current system state and where on the wet-dry spectrum that system risk lies, all on the low end right now, it's appropriate to hedge strongly towards dry scenarios, which Jim was doing for the short-term analyses. And conversely, I think it's appropriate to exclude wet scenarios. Anything above 15 or even 14 million acre feet is just a distraction and kind of pollutes our view of what is necessary and important. Folks, I want to thank. Last thing, Colorado River Wiki. This is something that Brad Udall, Julie Vano, and I have been working on with a new postdoc, Tanya Pitak. Is not ready for prime time public launch this fall. If you're interested in contributing, want to know more about it, please find me, Brad, or Tanya here, or email us or Julie Vano later. And thank you so much for your time and patience.
So I want to thank Jim and Jeff and an observation that in the dozen years that I have been coming here and in the longer set of years that many of you have been working on it, we have seen in front of us the transition from climate change as an important piece of science that we need to hypothetically be thinking about what we might do in the future to Commissioner Tooten's comments to Congress 2 days ago that we need to cut 2 to 4 million acre feet out of the river now. So thank you very much for the panel again. We have a little less than 20 minutes for a break. I want to be sure to get you all back in your seats. 10:30, Assistant Secretary Trujillo will be talking to us, and she's an Assistant Secretary. We don't want to keep her waiting. So see you in 20. So folks, thanks much. If we could end our conversations and so we can move on. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker. All of you know her already, but in brief, Tanya Trujillo first explained the law of the Colorado River to me in a memorable meeting in the patio at the Albuquerque Journal when she was the general counsel in the Mexico Interstate Stream Commission and I was a newspaper reporter. It turns out to be much more complicated than our initial discussion suggested. Tanya has been helping us with Colorado River governance in a variety of positions on Capitol Hill, in the executive branch of government, in the Colorado River Board of California, working with NGOs. And in this time of crisis, I cannot think of a more qualified Colorado River governance expert to try to help us navigate around the boulders in the rapids before us. Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, Tanya Trujillo, thanks for joining us.
Hello, John. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, John, for the introduction. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be speaking with you all as part of the conference today. I regret very much that I can't be there in person. And I know that there are many friends and colleagues in the room there. I know that you are all hearing the information that we're presenting and taking these issues very seriously. And I want to say from the start, thank you for the work that's going on there and elsewhere throughout the basin to try to get through some of the challenges that we have now. I think now is more important than ever to be focused on the Colorado River Basin. I appreciate following the presentations from Jim and Jeff this morning because it is so important that our work be based in science and that I know how much effort they put into ensuring that they are providing accurate technical information, and I'm grateful for that. We have a great team at the Bureau of Reclamation. The commissioner is an incredible leader, a good friend of mine for a long time, and we couldn't be better positioned to be getting through these issues under her leadership and with the team there at Reclamation. I know we have incredible challenges and opportunities right now in every basin. Unfortunately, we have critical situations to be addressing in every basin, but we have to be able to do things with a multitasking approach. We have to be able to do more than one things at the same time. So in addition to concentrating on the emergency situations, addressing the urgent needs that we have throughout the basin, we are also working on the longer term planning and operational adjustments so that we can build resiliency and ensure our water systems will be able to continue to function for the foreseeable future. I know there is a lot going on right now. We have not only in the Colorado River Basin, but elsewhere around the country, there is flooding right now in Montana, in the Yellowstone area, just putting water systems at risk, which is temporarily closing Yellowstone Park. I have just returned from meetings in the Columbia River Basin where we were talking about the dynamic situation that we have there in the interconnected operations that we have with Canada. We were observing, again, some unprecedented conditions where the operators of the system are having to draw down reservoirs at times that they normally do not. They're having to make adjustments in real time for how to respond to the changing conditions that we're seeing. And we're doing those real-time operations at the same time we're thinking about the long-term planning for the system, ways to protect the fish and wildlife and the water users throughout the system in both countries. I know, I admit it was nice to be up there in Canada, to be among the green and rainy forests, but it was just a reminder of the contrast that we're seeing in places like my hometown and my home state in New Mexico, where I was recently there with many of you and was continually reminded of the just unseasonable, hot, dry, and windy conditions that we're seeing in many places around the Colorado River Basin. I know we have excessive heat warnings in several areas now. And I am calling in today from the Central Valley in California, And throughout California, we've seen unprecedented drought conditions and historically low water allocations that have had real impacts on the communities that we are interacting with and on the ecosystem function. It affects the food supply, the municipal supplies. All of the sectors are impacted now by the continuing drought. There in the Colorado River Basin, I know the drought conditions make it clear that now is the time to be taking action. As was mentioned this morning, the Senate Energy Committee held an oversight hearing on Tuesday, where we began to examine some of the short and long-term solutions that we have to addressing the drought around the country. And they heard directly from Commissioner Tootin about the critical conditions that exist in many areas and in the Colorado River Basin. Again, I'm so grateful to have her leadership at the Bureau and to have her to be able to work closely with as we get through these tough conditions. I also wanted to acknowledge and compliment Colorado's own Senator Michael Bennet, who also last week chaired the Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Subcommittee on Conservation, Climate, Forestry, and Natural Resources. The hearing in that committee was titled Western Water Crisis, Confronting Persistent Drought and Building Resilience of Our Forests and Farmland. All of the discussions that occurred in that hearing were equally important to the issues that we're addressing today in the Colorado River Basin. And both of the hearings have involved bipartisan support for the continued actions that we need to address the urgent needs in our community. In addition to the close attention that we have from Congress, we all know that we have a large amount of attention and focus from the national media and the local media that are paying close attention to what is happening in our basin. All eyes are upon us now, and we need to be careful and take the responsibility seriously to take careful action as we move forward in this basin. We have urgent needs to act now, and there's never been a greater time in the basin for people to come together and think about the future of the river. As you've heard from Jim Prairie just now, the Colorado River Basin faces greater risks than any other time in our modern history. The conditions we are seeing will most likely continue throughout the summer. We need to be prepared to address them. The analysis that Jim was presenting isn't new information. I think the only new news is that we continue to see the dry hydrology that's progressing. We've seen now one more year of the terrible runoff conditions, and I appreciate the detail that he went into explaining the circumstances. And as Commissioner Tootin explained and expressed earlier this week at the Senate Energy Committee, we anticipate needing massive reductions in water use this year in order to stop our key reservoirs from falling further. We have estimated that between 2 and 4 million acre feet of additional conservation will be needed just to protect the critical levels in 2023. We have the responsibility and the authority to take the action that we need to take to protect the system. Last month, working with partners across the basin, we took unprecedented steps to ensure that the infrastructure at Glen Canyon Dam could remain reliable and that the water resources available from the reservoir could remain available. We took these actions to ensure short-term reliability, but we are facing the growing reality that water supplies for agriculture, fisheries, ecosystems, industry, and cities are no longer stable due to climate change. On May 3rd, which is only a little over a month from today, we announced 2 separate drought response actions that were designed to help Lake Powell storage by increasing and adding approximately 1 million acre feet over the next 12 months. The 2 actions include bringing down approximately 500,000 acre feet which will be released from Flaming Gorge Reservoir, and a parallel action of holding back 480,000 acre feet that will be left in Lake Powell and not released immediately from Glen Canyon Dam to the lower basin. Those unprecedented and important actions were taken with the spirit of transparency and inclusiveness, and the actions were based in the sound technical information that we have continued to receive from Reclamation. That information has enabled us to work closely with our partners to continue to develop those tools and the additional tools that we will be able to use and we will need to use going forward. As Jim Prairie has described, and as Commissioner Tootin said earlier this week, there is much more work to be done in the basin because the conditions continue to worsen and deeper shortages are projected in 2023. I know many of you are aware of this. You are taking it seriously and you are working hard to make sure we can have some viable solutions available in the very, very near term. At Interior, we have an obligation to protect the physical infrastructure that we own and operate so that we can ensure it will continue to operate in the manner that it was designed. That infrastructure provides benefits to the communities that we serve and that rely on the Colorado River for the essential water supplies. And that applies to all sectors: agricultural sectors, municipal sectors, environmental uses, our tribal partners in the basin, our partners in Mexico. We're all invested in the future security of this basin. Our collective goal is to be able to very quickly identify and implement strategies that will stabilize and rebuild the system so that we don't find ourselves constantly on the brink of a crisis. But at the same time, we need to be thinking about what the next phases of the Colorado River operational decision-making will look like. I appreciate having the opportunity this morning to highlight some of the actions we have recently taken and to describe some of the actions that we have coming up on the horizon. I think a piece of good news that we have as a backdrop is that we now have an incredible amount of funding resources available as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law. The unprecedented resources that we have will enable us to continue to be able to work collaboratively with states, tribes, and local entities as we try to address some of the current challenges. The investments provide critical funding to address the water and drought situation that we have and invest in the longer term repairs of our aging infrastructure and maintenance of our critical facilities. Last November, the president signed the law. Reclamation received an additional $8.3 billion on top of our regular appropriations, our annual appropriations. We can use that funding in a variety of ways to help address the changing challenges that we do have. We are able to focus on climate resilience through repairs to infrastructure. We're able to focus on additional programs to build water efficiency and do more water recycling. We can develop storage capabilities underground and on the surface. We can enable and develop new programs to learn about watershed protection and strengthen our tools that we have in the watershed protection area. We have, through the infrastructure funding, also received additional funding, $2.5 billion of additional funding to help support the existing authorized Indian water rights settlement projects. And it has been great to be able to be in some of our tribal communities recently to be able to celebrate the accomplishments and the progress that we have been able to make on those settlements. I know a portion of the funding that we have from the bipartisan infrastructure law is targeted directly for the Colorado River Basin, and we are committed to making sure we can make the best use of that funding as quickly as possible in order to be able to respond to the urgent needs that we have in the basin. We have a significant amount of coordination happening within the Department of the Interior, along with our sister bureaus as well, our sister entities in the department. I have been continuing to coordinate with my counterpart, the Fish and Wildlife and Parks divisions. I was happy to be able to meet with some of our science teams who are working on our issues at the Grand Canyon a few weeks ago. We understand how interconnected all of our issues are. We continue at all times to do outreach and make progress with respect to our tribal trust responsibilities, ensuring that we are available to our tribes as partners. We are available to them in the context, whether it's relating to completion of the Indian water rights settlements or in connection with the ability to provide an unprecedented amount of technical support to the partners that we have in our tribal communities. I appreciate the Reclamation team's extra efforts in that regard. We are also coordinating with the other federal agencies that we're working with. I know Reclamation is working very closely with WAPA and our other agencies to track the impacts to our hydropower production and think through additional strategies that we will need. We are also working closely with NOAA and Inniss and the information agencies to develop better forecasting and analysis tools. And we are looking for additional coordination opportunities with other agencies such as the Department of Agriculture, EPA, and the Corps of Engineers, who we were coordinating with just as recently as this week on the Columbia River Basin issues. We have the attention and support from the White House for our efforts. I attended the announcement a few weeks ago with the Vice President regarding the release of our Interagency Drought Task Force report that identifies the various efforts underway among our federal agencies. As a Californian, she understands the importance of water, she understands the impacts of drought, and she is available to help us be responsive to the conditions that we are seeing, in addition to the president as well. We have regular coordinations efforts underway with the Climate Office and the Climate Task Force. And we have an appropriately prioritized effort underway to develop the drought response actions that we are going to need to address the conditions that we have around the West. It's an honor for me to be part of the team at the Department of the Interior, working with Secretary Holland on these issues, and to be part of the administration's efforts at this time. To focus again on the Colorado River Basin, the actions that we were able to undertake just last month to start efforts to protect the infrastructure at Lake Powell were taken in the context of the extraordinary circumstances that we are seeing in the basin, and after significant coordination with many of the entities there in the room. We invoked the authority to change the operations at Glen Canyon Dam for the first time. The two measures that we took will allow more water to flow into Lake Powell and protect the dam. We've heard already about the process undertaken to develop the 2022 Drought Response Operations Plan and to authorize the additional water to be released throughout this year. We will be carefully tracking those actions and monitoring the situation as we proceed. We took the parallel action to withhold water from release from Lake Powell as well. And we took that in coordination with all of the states, partners, tribes, and our partners in Mexico as we were thinking through the options for the short-term measures that we needed to take. Those measures, the measures that we took last month, the actions that we took last month, the actions that we are continuing to enact and develop as we move forward through the remainder of the summer and the remainder of the year. All of those actions are built off of our prior efforts, and they will also be helpful in allowing us to develop new strategies going forward. We are constantly watching the operations and thinking about the conditions we are seeing. With respect to what comes next, many of you are aware that Carly Jurla with the Bureau of Reclamation will be leading the efforts to analyze and address options for operations in the post-2026 world. Our next steps for that process will be building off of all of the various elements that we have already learned about, we have already undertaken over the past 20, 25 years. We will need to be considering the feedback that the Department of the Interior received in 2019 through its review of the guidelines in the built-in process called the 7D review. We will be taking into consideration the hydrologic changes we have seen over the past 20 years of drought, low runoff conditions, and a changing climate. We will have to implement a process that is more inclusive going forward to ensure that our tribal communities are engaged at a greater level than ever before, and that we have a broad base of input and feedback to how the process is developing, including working hand in hand with our partners in Mexico. We are targeting the ability to initiate a NEPA process to develop our post-2026 operating approaches in early 2023. The technical information and the lessons learned from our management of the system under the current guidelines will be very helpful as we try to develop the new guidelines to ensure that they are going to be durable and drought resilient. Additionally, we will have collaboration and involvement by many of our stakeholders, as I have mentioned. Starting with, before we begin the formal NEPA process in early next year, we are going to be preparing a pre-scoping notice in the Federal Register, hopefully released as early as next week, to ask for input on both stakeholder engagement process for the guidelines development and substantive elements and strategies for the post-2026 operations. We are going to be seeking input on specific suggestions on how the process should be developed and what the substance of that process should include. How should we analyze our future operations, and what operations should we be considering? We want to hear directly from everyone who has a stake in this basin. We intend to develop our next operating rules in an inclusive, transparent manner, again, relying on the best available science. We will review and consider all of the information that we receive this summer and take it into consideration as we plan to initiate the formal EIS process next year. We'll take all of us coming together to work on that effort, and again, building off of the hopeful success that we will have in the short-term process as well. The proposal for the pre-scoping information request will be consistent with our themes of wanting to be as inclusive as possible, and we are committed to having a transparent process as we move forward with that. We have an incredible amount of activity happening in the basin right now, including the conference that you're attending this week. We've had 2 congressional hearings in the past week, and I imagine that we'll be asked to appear at more. We have tribal information sessions scheduled. One was held last week with the 10 Tribes Partnership. We have another scheduled for today. Our teams are working very hard to make sure we can reach as many audiences and impacted communities as possible as we try to describe the evolving conditions that we are seeing and demonstrate how important and critical the current situation is, how important it is in the context of the critical situation that we develop actionable items to be able to make a difference in how our supply is going to be managed for the short-term situation. We are also working, again, a meeting will occur later today with our partners in Mexico to discuss the continued efforts that they may be able to help us with. We have ongoing conversations with our counterparts at the leadership at the IBWC and CELA to ensure that we can have their coordination and their cooperation as we are moving forward in this critical time. We have continued public information opportunities available. We publish our regular 24-month study, the new version out today. We have a process undergoing to develop the annual operating plans and are working at all times to ensure that the information we are providing is available as broadly as possible. We will continue to have public webinars and outreach sessions, including in connection with the pre-scoping analysis that we are going to be undertaking. So please stay tuned for more information on all of the activities. I want to again thank you all for your continued interest and participation in the efforts that we have underway. We need to do more than we've ever done before. We have at the department authority and responsibility to take action. We know we will be served better if we take action collectively, working with our partners in the basin. We need to be evaluating those options this year, starting today, starting last week, actually. But we need to be able to build in additional proactive measures to be thinking about how to manage for the conditions next year. Our teams at the Department of the Interior will keep our sleeves rolled up. We will continue to evaluate what we have available, the authorities we have available, the actions we may be able to take. We will continue to work with those of you in the room who are willing and interested to work with us. We have resources now to be available to help. We have dedicated staff to continue to work on utilizing those resources and developing additional science-based solutions and strategies. I thank you again all for being responsible partners in our efforts. It is painful. My heart hurts not to be there in person, but it's also a process that is painful because of the severe situation that we are facing now. I am happy to be able to be supporting the teams at Reclamation, whether it's here in California as we address urgent needs and prioritize our infrastructure strategies here, or there in the Colorado River Basin, or my home basin of New Mexico. It's an incredible team to be working with. I look forward to hearing updates of how the rest of the conference goes. I'm happy to answer questions as part of this panel, but would ask that the Reclamation technical folks could also be available too if we're going to be having the Q&A portion. So thank you all. Hope everything goes well with the rest of the sessions.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary. We have time. We have about 15 minutes for questions. I would like to use the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question. I'm very appreciative of Commissioner Tooten's comments before the Senate on Tuesday, and I'd like to ask a clarifying question that has come up that I keep being asked. So she talked about the need for immediate conservation of 2 to 4 million acre feet. She talked about the desire for collaboration and for the parties to come forward with a plan. She also talked about Reclamation's authorities, the threat of federal action looming over that. Could you clarify the Upper Basin's role in your expectations? Is the expectation that the states of the Upper Basin will be making contributions and that you are looking at authorities in the Upper Basin for Reclamation to unilaterally looking for opportunities for Reclamation to act unilaterally in the Upper Basin as an alternative?
Thank you, John, for that question and for all of the interest from all of the states. I know one of the items I left off in my list of the activities going on, which wasn't on purpose, but I know the Upper Basin Commission met earlier this week as well, and that there is a significant amount of work underway in the Upper Basin to think through options for management and conservation in the Upper Basin states. I would answer your question by saying we need to be taking action in all states, in all sectors, and in all available ways. And so we will be evaluating our options in both basins. We need to be thinking as one basin. We need to be thinking collectively and creatively about how to develop the additional conservation that we are going to need to protect that basic infrastructure. I have tasked, and I've worked closely with Commissioner Tootin on this effort. We have tasked the reclamation teams to come to us with lists of available options, and that it's my expectation that that's exactly what is happening in both basins. I think I want to reinforce the goal is to try to be working collectively with the partners in each of the states and with Mexico to think through how we as a federal government can help the local states, the local communities do the additional conservation efforts as well. Long answer to your question of yes.
No, that was super helpful, thanks. From the audience. Come on, this is the Assistant Secretary, y'all.
If it's necessary for the Interior to make a very serious decision about the allocation of water on the river, who specifically is the chain of command that would be involved in that? Is that known, or can you mention that?
At the Department of the Interior, the Secretary has broad authorities, and I am the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, which is tasked with some of the authorities in our normal chain of command process. And then we work very closely with the Bureau of Reclamation and with the other bureaus at the department to ensure that we have a good amount of coordination on all of the actions that we are undertaking.
I got plenty more questions. I don't know if she wants to keep having me ask the questions.
I can't, I'm sorry, I can't see the mood in the room. I can't.
It's glowing.
I can't tell how things are going, but I know many of you, I've worked closely with many of you. This is tremendously sobering information. It is, it's a story that none of us want to be part of right now, I think, and we have to rely on our continued commitment to figure out some strategies. So it's something I know personally I'm committed to. I have a great team to be working with at the federal government. I know in each of the states and each of the communities that we're working with, there are similarly committed people. So I have the continued optimism that we can get through this, but it's, again, very, very sobering situation.
Yeah, thank you, Assistant Secretary. Appreciate your time. My question was about the 2 to 4 million acre feet as well, and the consumption cutbacks. How do you see those playing out? Like specific examples? Is that like the ICS just expanded for larger amounts of water? Is that trying to sell people on, eating less vegetables in the winter? So there's, less water needed for irrigation, grassroots efforts, any sort of idea of how we can meet these cuts that seem to be, clearly needed.
And I apologize, but I can't see who the requester is.
Yeah, my name is Greg Bola. I'm a student at the Colorado School of Mines.
Excellent. We need more students. And I was recently out there for an event with the USGS, so looking forward to continuing to stay connected there. I think the question is, do we have any specific recipe in mind for how to go about generating the water savings and the additional water that we need to protect the system? The short answer is no. We don't have a formula already pre-baked and pre-worked, but we're no doubt about it, we're going to have to be very creative and develop a large list of potential options for us. I focus back on try to provide resources and funding and assistance to the local entities to help them develop programs that might work best in their respective communities. We have independent authorities at the department to be able to try to adjust with respect to our operational flexibilities. So we're going to have to be doing all of that at the same time. And fortunately, we have committed folks who are thinking about this on a daily basis, but we're going to likely be in a situation of doing things we've never done before. And we'll have to have guts to be able to move forward in some of those situations.
Okay, this is Kevin Wheeler. Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious, I know one of the challenges for the reoperations of the two reservoirs is the different markets, power generation markets between Hoover and Glen Canyon. I'm curious what efforts or what thinking there is about better coordinating the operations, or at least the marketing or the sales side of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll confess from the start that I'm not an expert in that field. I know the reclamation teams that deal with the power supply issues and power generation are working on those questions. If anyone's there in the room that has capability of answering, please speak up. But I think I would say we're open to suggestions. We're open to feedback. We need to be, again, in that mindset of trying to think creatively about how to address the unprecedented circumstance that we have. Hydropower is a critical component of our energy grid, our energy supply. The sales of hydropower fund many of our critical programs, including infrastructure repair and maintenance, including our endangered species compliance and ecosystem conservation programs. So it's an important part of what we're working on.
Thank you. We have a question online from Jenny Ross at the Stout Research Center in California. Does the Assistant Secretary have a target in mind regarding how the 2 to 4 million acre-foot cuts in usage should be apportioned between the upper and lower basins?
Again, I think our technical teams are always thinking about that, always evaluating the conditions that are evolving. We have existing rules that we have to be guided by as well. And so we don't have anything that's predetermined or pre-baked. We'll have to be looking to see what works best for the management of the system.
Thanks.
Hi, Tanya. This is Jennifer Gimbel from Colorado State. How are you? I have a question. You're to be commended for trying to make it an inclusive process, and I think that's great. But I have a question about the Grand Canyon. And I know the Glen Canyon Protection Act is a piece of what we look at on the river. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on in the Grand Canyon?
There's a lot going on everywhere, Jennifer. I think, as I mentioned, I had the opportunity to be at the Grand Canyon a few weeks ago, and in a fairly informal context was able to talk with some of the science teams that we have at the Department of the Interior, working on such a big variety of issues, from dealing with sediment issues and species habitat, bug flow responses, measuring that huge variety of issues that are going on. I will say we are absolutely committed to continuing the ongoing efforts in the LTEP context, in the context of the existing statutes and responsibilities that we have. I know I want to compliment the team at Reclamation from the Upper Colorado region. Not sure who's there at the conference today, but we have had a tremendous amount of support and oversight with respect to how the AMWIG process has been going and the LTIMP experiments have been going. It's the same context of trying to have to adaptively manage based on the conditions that we're seeing. And I appreciate the amount of coordination that has been going on among the various agencies and bureaus. It's not an easy dialogue. None of these questions are easy. And there's a lot of give and take that takes place. I'll take the opportunity again. I forgot to mention this earlier. As I understand, David Palumbo is there at the conference. He was the acting commissioner, working closely with me for a few months earlier this year, and really has done a tremendous job of trying to ensure that we do have that close coordination with our reclamation team and our other partner bureaus. And I want to just publicly thank and acknowledge the great work thank David and acknowledge the great work that he contributes to reclamation on a daily basis.
So thanks much, and we have time for one more question, and I'm going to again use the moderator's prerogative to ask it myself. You are one of a number of people, many of them in this room, who over the last dozen years helped me understand and write, I thought persuasively about the value and the importance of the collaborative governance process and its successes in the Colorado River Basin. And yet that collaborative governance process has left us with a 2 to 4 million acre foot shortfall in the reservoirs that's requiring crisis level actions. Were we all overselling the successes of the collaborative governance? And if not, what are the lessons we can learn going forward to capture the best of that while still recognize how short it left us of water?
Well, I'll say I don't know that we can blame the governance process on the current hydrology, but I would give credit to the governance process for allowing us to develop the tools that we have been able to develop to slow the decline. I think without the creative tools that we have through the 2007 guidelines, through the additional layers of the DCP process, through the additional layers of our coordination with Mexico, we would be in much worse situation than we are now. So the collaborative governance process has helped us, and we'll have to rely on the prior successes, but do even more and do even better going forward. And I want to take, John, I'll copy off of your saying, I don't want us to be in the chaos category. I think we need to have as much progress as possible along the trajectory that we have been on to help develop new ways of staying above the critical elevations. And again, it's a plea to all of us in the room. It's a plea to all of us working on the river to try to figure out how to do this in a collaborative way. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Trujillo. So thanks again to Assistant Secretary Trujillo. Sorry we couldn't see you here in person. Happy to have you join us virtually. The next panel, I'm going to be shifting from my role as MC to my role as moderator. And one of the conversations that the five of us have had over the last 36 to 48 hours is the extent to which everything has changed beneath our feet with Commissioner Tooten's comments to the Senate on Tuesday. We envisioned this panel on the 100th anniversary of the Colorado River Compact's development in 1922 as a chance to review some of the outstanding questions that we have about the comment. And in a long exchange with one of the people who helped me think through the implications of the issues that we were thinking about, this person suggested that, maybe these questions are in fact moot. We are where we are now. But the fact is that the Colorado River Compact remains a guiding document. The fact is that we look to it for guidance to help us make decisions. But there are enormous ambiguities in the compact itself, unresolved questions. And we have a long history in this basin of papering over those uncertainties in the compact in a way that allows a substantial segment of the water using community in the Colorado River Basin to use more water, whether it is non-Indian water users in general, whether it is sending extra water downstream past Lee's Ferry, rather than arguing over what the delivery or non-depletion argument might be. And so the point is, we've papered over these problems for a century with bonus water, with surplus water, with extra water. We've got none of that bonus, extra, surplus water anymore. We may very well be moving in these discussions in the next 2 months beyond the constraints of the compact as we think about how do we live within the constraints of the law of the river, and also a river that is substantially smaller than the law of the river suggested. But for the purposes of this panel, first of all, let me explain a little bit of logistics, kind of a weird panel. We're going to have about 45 minutes between now and the lunch break for a presentation by Eric, and then some discussion on the panel members. We'll take a break. Then we'll come back, and I want to have a broader discussion with myself and the audience, interrogating these folks about the issues that we are raising. So I want to start with Eric Kuhn, who was the inspiration for the idea behind this panel, to give a little bit of a presentation and an overview over what these unresolved questions in the Colorado River Compact are. Eric.
Well, thank you, John. Yeah, this is interesting because I thought that this year would be John and I and others would be spending a lot of time talking about the 100th anniversary of the compact, and that really has been put on the back burner because of what's in front of us. But nonetheless, to quote Norris Hundley, the consequences of the compact remain. It's not something, as John said, that we can avoid. So if I think I can get this right, what my conversation today is going to be about is avoiding what Jim Lockhead called the first flow compact tripwire. And as you recall, Jim now is the manager of Denver Water, but for many years he was the Upper Colorado River Commissioner for almost 20 years from Colorado. He represented the organization that I worked for, the Colorado River District, on interstate issues for a long time. So Jim is an incredible resource. And I remember years ago saying, one of the things we need to avoid is that first flow tripwire of 82.5 million acre feet per year. Now, the first tripwire, of course, why 82.5? Well, it's simple. It's 75 million acre feet, which is the 10-year non-depletion obligation, plus half of the normal Mexican treaty delivery of 1.5 million acre feet per year times 10. So that's 8.25. For those of you who are interested, you can go back and look at the debates they had in the 70s over the promulgation of the first LROC, the first long-range operating criterion, what was called the minimum objective release. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. I question whether it's still relevant. But the bottom line is the states of the upper division, as opposed to the upper basin, have never agreed that they must deliver 750 or half the Mexican treaty delivery every year. And I say half the Mexican treaty because if under the minutes now it's 1.4 million, technically, their obligation is 700,000. Now, since the filling of the Lake Powell, the filling criteria ended in I believe it was June of 1980. It was about the time I started working on the river. The flows have always exceeded 82.5. They got close in 2001 through 2010, but they've always well exceeded 82.5. But now, however, when you look at what Jim Prairie and others presented today, the 5-year probabilistic table, there's a probability or a possibility that flows could drop below 82.5 million as early as 2025, more likely 2026, certainly 2027, depending on the hydrology. Now, my point is a dispute over a compact interpretation has the potential to disrupt the cooperative efforts to develop the post-2026 operating rules, and I think we're doing that right now. Let's not kid ourselves. What's going on today and what's going on in the future, what we decide to do over the next couple of years will really influence those post-2026 operating rules. So if a 2 to 4, my question is, if a 2 to 4 million acre foot reduction is the elephant in the room, is the compact the elephant's shadow? Here's the 5-year CRMMS projections. And these are really shocking to me. I mean, there's a 90% probability that Powell will be in the lower elevation balancing tier next year. That's pretty clear, but it's 50% the year after. It's 37 per, it's still 70% below 35.75 in the 2 following years. And I think Jim Prairie and others would agree this is based on the 91 to 2020 hydrology. If you were to base that based on the 2000 to 2020, 21 hydrology, you'd get numbers that are substantially higher than this. So this has that wet year bias from the 90s in it. Now, I simply assumed, and I just looked at the 24-month study that was released today, that the releases in 2022, 23, 24, 25, and 26 would be as follows: 7, 7, 748, 748, 748. Now, that's not going to happen. Those are the most probable for each of those years, but it's unlikely to happen in that sequence. The assumptions that leaf area flows equal the releases from the dam plus 120,000 acre feet. That's to account for the nice little springs we have down there below the dam and the Prairie River. There is huge uncertainty when Lake Powell is in the operating in the bottom tier because it's 7 to 9.5, and you got to balance at the end of the reservoir. So how the lower basin succeeds in reducing its uses impacts what's going on in Powell, and we all know that. And I'm assuming that lower basin conservation will keep meat above 1025. I think that's a reasonable assumption. You don't think so, huh, John? Okay, I'm being optimistic. Well, this is what happens. You see, we approach 82.5 in year 2025. We dip below it in 2026. Now, deliveries to Mexico will also be reduced. And so this, that 82.5 will be reduced by a few 100,000 acre feet, but it's not going to make a million acre foot difference. I think there are lots of good reasons this is not a compact problem. First, of course, is the reservoirs are being operated in a collaborative manner by Interior with buy-in from all of the states. A compact, I say, could interfere with the collaborative process. I think it's more likely it would interfere with the collaborative process. A second reason is, and this one's getting a little speculative, climate change, not upper basin depletions, which are, upper basin is depleting about 4, is the primary reason leaf area flows are or will be below 82.5. Now, this new argument has really not been vetted by the academic and legal community, and I'd be interested in their thoughts on that. But also, it could potentially impact many Western U.S. states that have compacts. I'll give you an example. Colorado has compacts on all 4 borders. It just doesn't have the Colorado River compact. So if Colorado argues that, well, we don't have to meet the 75/10 because of climate change, is that giving, Kansas or Nebraska or New Mexico or Texas on the Rio Grande or the Arkansas or the South Platte compacts, are they feeding that argument that all of these compacts have to be redone because climate change, the rivers, quite frankly, are not the same, and in some cases are nowhere near like the rivers they were when these compacts were negotiated. And then the final one, and this is the one that gets the most, that historically has gotten the most attention. There have been numerous papers written about it. The upper division states do not have an obligation to provide half the treaty delivery to Mexico each and every year. Again, I think there's probably 24 really good papers written by some really smart people about this. And here's Article 3C, talking about it a little bit. You know, the key thing here is that the compact negotiators, one of the myths is the compact negotiators split the river evenly between the upper basin and the lower basin. Yeah, that's garbage. They split the river into 3 parts, and this is found in Article 1. They split it 8.5 for the lower basin, 7.5 for the upper basin, and a surplus. Carpenter said that surplus was about 4.5 million acre feet. Hoover said it was 5. Others, Norvell in Arizona said it was 6 or 7. So that surplus is the surplus they were talking about here. So water, if there was a treaty with Mexico, the water to be given from Mexico was the difference between the average water available below Yuma, not at Lee Ferry, and 16 million acre feet. That was to go to Mexico. That's very clear from the writing from primarily the compact reports, but also the testimony of all the commissioners. Now, is there 16 million acre feet below Yuma? Certainly not. Not in the last 30 years. Probably if we drop out what we call the early 20th century pluvial, there's never been 16 million acre feet of water below Yuma in natural flow. So there's never been a surplus. However, the upper basin states, the upper division states, excuse me, have a more sophisticated argument. They point to the fact, and I think I saw an article about this morning, that the upper basin doesn't have a compact obligation because the lower basin is consumptively using more than its compact apportionment of 8.5 million acre feet. And before the upper division states have an obligation to Mexico, the lower basin has to reduce its total consumptive uses to 8.5 million acre feet. Lockhead made that argument as a commissioner, actually, and it was printed in 2001 in the Denver Law Review Journal. Larry McDonald, others have made that argument. I think there's some backing for that in what the commissioner's reports. There's some backing for that in what Rifkin said in his non-binding, interesting little side section on the compact. But it's an interesting argument. And I think it's a very effective argument from a West Slope resident. It's a very effective argument up here. Why should the upper basin be cutting back when it's only using 4 million acre feet when the lower basin is using 10? Now, you got to count lower basin evaporation off the main stem, and you've got to count lower basin tributary use. Lower basin tributary use, that's that issue that we've fought about forever and has never really been resolved. So going on, if we challenge the upper basin's flow or deliveries to Mexico, it doesn't stop there. It literally quickly engulfs the whole compact. You know, first are the lower basin tributaries covered by the 1922 compact. Well, in the 1957 filing, the amended case that the Arizona made before the Supreme Court, they said, no, the compact only. And the combination of the compact and the 1929 Boulder Canyon Project Act only apportioned water on the main stem. And they make that case. The Supreme Court noted that in their opinion and said, we need not go there because we're not interpreting the compact, we're interpreting the Boulder Canyon Project Act. You know, so, and that brings in, what's the role of that extra million acre feet, the 3B? And you talk to 50 different lawyers on the river and you probably get 50 different answers about that. You know, so that's one that has to be addressed. It has to be addressed if you're going to challenge the upper basin's delivery obligation. The other thing, and this is really shocking, after 100 years, there is no generally accepted accounting methodology for how you account apportionments. It's not, I could tell you this, it's not the consumptive uses and losses report. I think we can all agree on that. What it is, we don't know. I will tell you, in the 40s and 50s, this argument consumed the Basin states and Congress and everybody else that dealt with the Colorado River. There were two competing methods. The first is that our apportionments under the compact were the sum of upstream diversions as measured by diversions less return flows. California and Nevada, I think Nevada, it's not really clear what Nevada was doing in those days, were backing that. The Arizona and the upper division states backed what's called the stream depletion theory. And I got to take you to the Gila River to say why. The Gila River at Phoenix is over 2 million acre feet, at least in the 50s it was, of natural flow. But left alone, it loses about 1 million acre feet as it flows to Yuma. So the net impact of Arizona's 2 million acre feet of uses on the Gila is only 1 million acre feet to the natural flow of the river at Yuma, right? At Phoenix, it's 2 million. At Yuma, it's 1 million. So basically, Arizona developed the stream depletion theory to get a 2-for-1 blue plate special. I could use 2 million acre feet on the Gila, but only charged with 1 million acre feet of apportionment. The upper basin states, the upper division states bought into it. Primarily because Royce Tipton, who was he was a consultant, he was extremely influential engineer. He worked for the State Department and the Central Arizona Project Association. He was the chief engineer for the Colorado Water Conservation Board and, oh, by the way, Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District and Denver Water. So he had some things here, and he pushed this on the upper division states, saying we could also benefit from this, the Gila, the salvage by use argument. The USGS and most Bureau of Reclamation engineers thought that was crazy. There's a difference between the Gila and the lower Colorado River as it goes through the canyons. In one case, the river's gone. There's no surface evaporation off the Gila River because it's not there in the hot summer. It's not there most of the months, years. Well, that's not the same, the river in the canyon. The river in the canyon is pretty much the same surface area for most of the time, maybe a little more during the spring runoff. But they bought into it, and the upper division states actually brought the stream depletion theory into the upper basin compact in Article 6. Now, it almost got the compact, the House committee that was dominated by Californians almost refused to ratify recommend that the full House ratify the compact because of this, but they worked that out. So here's the bottom line. Under the diversions less return flow theory, the lower basin is probably using more than 8.5, but under the stream depletion theory, it may not be, because I think the Gila River system today, the natural flow of no one knows what the hell it would be, but I'm guessing 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 acre feet at most. You add 7 million, you add another, let's say, 750,000 acre feet for reservoir evaporation and maybe 600,000 or 700,000 for lower basin tributaries, you're under 8.5. And there are other issues as well that I won't go into. Section 4A of the Boulder Canyon Project Act, what did the Supreme Court say? All of those issues are up there. And I think we could fight for 20 years and not have any answers to these questions. It would be an engineer's dream to do this, to model this. So the problem's not going away. In 2022 to 2026, we'll create a compact whole. So my assumption here is that beginning in 2027, we start releasing 823. We go underneath the 82.5 by about 3.5 to 4 million acre feet before we start recovering. Remember all those 9 million acre foot releases that the CAP loved in 2015 to 2019? Well, they individually each year, they go out of the 10-year running average and they're replaced by a 748 or something else. So the number goes down and you create a hole. Bottom line is the upper basin needs about 13 million acre feet of long-term natural flow, taking this back to what Jim Prairie said this morning, to deliver 8.25. With 12, you can barely make 7.5. And that's if you have lots of storage. So this is a real world issue moving forward. Questions? The subbasins have always found a way to agree to disagree. always found that way. Arizona and California, not so much, but between the basin, that's true. Can we continue with this approach of agreeing to disagree, given the hydrologic limitations we will face in the future? If we can't, what are the alternatives? How do we avoid these compact tripwires in the negotiations for the post-2026 operating rules? Is the 1922 compact, are the numbers in the 22 compact still relevant in the post-2022 world? And I'll finally go on and say tribes all have pre-compact rights. I mean, this is pretty clear. So what is the role of the tribes in avoiding these compact tripwires? They're a part of the role now. They're a part of the river now. They weren't when these compacts were negotiated, but now they are. So what's their role in, trying to get us through a compact that was based on a river that no longer exists? John, do you want me to ask the? Go ahead. I think we'll just go down in order, and now let Amy Haas add her thoughts to this presentation and where else we might want to go as a panel.
Folks hear me? Yes, okay, now you can. Well, after that, I think we should just skip lunch and go right to happy hour. I don't really sound like an adopted Utahn, do I? So I think probably the most important thing I'm going to say today is that my comments do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Governor Spencer Cox or River Commissioner Gene Shawcroft or any of the individual or collective upper division states. My comments are my own, and I will leave it at that. So that's my big disclaimer. So remember that. And I think it's really Eric has hit some of the key uncertainties and ambiguities around the 22 compact, and I think every article in the compact is replete with questions. And I'm going to just talk about a few of those. But I want to come back to the concept of equity under Article 1. Every stream, interstate stream compact endeavors to affect an equitable apportionment. And in this case, an equitable apportionment and division of the waters of the Colorado River. What is equity when we're looking at hydrology like this? And how do we drill down on this very glaringly undefined term in the compact? And I think that applies to, our 75/10 non-depletion obligation. It applies to, the Mexican deficiency issue that Eric has laid out well, and it applies to some other key substantive provisions of the compact. And I'm happy to drill down, but I will continue to come back to equity. And then the other thing is, I think modelers love to talk about backcasting and looking behind, and we do that this year in terms of recognizing the centennial of the 22 compact. But I'd like to forward cast a little bit and talk about what our options may be for living within this very rigid compact framework, meanwhile addressing the vicissitudes of hydrology and some of the realities we're facing today. So those are my preliminary remarks. John, do you want to just kind of have me pass it down to my fellow panelists here? Great.
We're all
mic'd. Yeah, that's right. Have it.
Well, I really appreciate being here. I want to say that I am not a representative of the lower basin as I sit here with upper basin geeks, but I have maybe more empathy for some of the challenges related to the lower basin, possibly as a native of Phoenix. And I also want to thank Eric for supremely geeking out on the case notes following Arizona versus California. I feel like that's what we did. We opened the law book, we read some cases, and then we just geeked out on the case notes. So that it's fun. I have two observations here, and one is I love the idea of climate change as kind of an act of God that disrupts aspects of the compact. I mean, that's a principle of contract interpretation, right? There can be this active God that sort of all bets are off. And in the case of climate change, could Central Arizona be using that argument too? Is Central Arizona's junior priority disrupted because we didn't anticipate climate change? If it works for the Upper Basin, then I think it works for Central Arizona too. And I would love to have a bigger discussion about who do we blame? If climate change is at fault, then who is responsible for sharing the impacts of climate change? And then my second big observation relates to, Amy, your comment about equity. There are important equity considerations here when we think about who's going to withstand the cuts, shortages. In Central Arizona, tribes have entitlements to about close to half of the CAP water. And this is an important equity issue that we can't overlook. If we're talking about cuts, are we going to wipe out the allocations for tribes in Central Arizona? If we're going to go further, we have, the Colorado River Indian tribes on the main stem have a significant entitlement to Colorado River, and that impact, the impact of further cuts to Arizona, I think is amplified when we're talking about cuts to tribal water, Colorado River water users. In addition, and I'm really talking about Central Arizona here, but there are impacts beyond simply the tribes and cities. A great deal of water, not a great deal, a couple 100,000 acre feet of water delivered to Central Arizona cities is used for in lieu recharge, essentially used for agriculture. So we're talking about additional impacts on agriculture in Arizona. So putting those together, I think, it is very interesting to open up the questions of equity, and maybe we are permitted to open up those questions in a new and different way because of Eric's clever argument about climate change is the bad guy here, not not the agreements that we've reached in the past or the depletions that we've made through the course of the Colorado Compact. Yep.
How much time do I have?
Daryl, it's always as much as you want.
Take all you want.
Lunch is in. I just want to say first, good morning, everybody, and I really appreciate, the invite by Getchers Wilkins to speak today, and I also too have a disclaimer. Again, of interacting with 30 tribal sovereigns in the basin, and today my comments, as Amy said, are pretty general in terms of my experience and my interaction with those 30 tribal sovereigns.
Can folks hear okay? Maybe.
Move your thing. Just speak up.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I guess I got the answer from the creator, huh? So yeah, I just, I want to just be, I'm very grateful to be here to be able to share. And again, understanding that my comments are mine today and based on the relationships that I hope created with 30 tribal sovereigns in the basin over the last 12 years. And, I just want to give a quick shout out to those people from the Friends of the Yampa. They invited me on their trip with American Rivers. And so I'm an official Yampire now. And we love the river and we feed on love and generosity. So if you want to become a Yampire, I highly suggest you get on the Yampa River. And I just really want to acknowledge that I'm very honored to be a part of this weird panel, you know? And I want to start off just by saying, you know, like when I was sitting there listening, no offense, Jeff and Jim, you know, I felt sick to my stomach, and I felt, you know, like this real like heaviness, and you know, my heart and my soul, like, wow, this is where we're at, you know. And there's many of us in this room who, like, for the last 12 years that I've been involved, have been like, this is where we're headed. And you know, fighting amongst our own peers in terms of like, you know, the absolute facts that were made available to us. So, and I'm so grateful because, you know, we're still having this conversation. We're not wrapped up in litigation yet. And so, you know, when I talk about my heart and my soul, you know, feeling pained, you know, it's absolutely about, you know, the connection that I have to this river, the connection that my tribe has to this river, and the 30 tribal sovereigns who have the same connection pretty much to this river. And to understand, you know, what is going on with the river and where we come from as a group of people from a spiritual perspective, and the amount of honor and that we give and value that we give to the river, yes, it's very, very painful to watch. And last year, you know, at this, you know, at a similar conference here, you know, John Echohawk from the Native American Rights Foundation talked about, you know, the absolute threat to Native Americans in the Colorado River Basin, that those processes for assimilation and particularly extermination were still active and in play. And I think that was an incredibly important message. And I want one that I want to echo, you know, because absolutely they are still in play. And so when we start to talk about climate change and the hydrology and what is the impact to tribes, you know, we talk about this being an existential threat, but tribes that are at a tipping point right now, you know, we talk a whole lot about, you know, including, you know, traditional environmental kind of knowledge that tribes have of the basin over the last, you know, 10, 13,000 years. And I saw one of the graphs today where the hydrology dipped in 1150 way down. We survived that. We survived that. And so when you start thinking about, you know, my tribe in particular, you know, Hickory Apache Nation, we're hunter-gatherers. Can't do that anymore on the piece of land that we got put on. And so when we start to imagine, you know, how can we apply traditional environmental knowledge and cultural knowledge to this current policy hydrologic situation? We can't. And so there's something, you know, and so you're asking us to share that knowledge with you when the situations on reservations themselves are pretty dire. And so when we're talking about climate change, and then inside of that water policy, absolutely, this is one of the most important things in my mind in terms of the future of a race of 30 beautiful tribal sovereigns in the basin. And at the heart of this is kind of what we're talking about, is this law of the river. And if you guys know me, have known me for 12 years, when I first came in here, maybe 10 years ago, I was like, I don't get this. You know, if the problem is the law of the river, why don't we just change the law of the river? Well, you can't do that. Well, okay. And so that was where I started. And so for 12 years, you know, through the help of a lot of you in here and my tribal partners, we've tried to tell you who we are, where we're at, what we're about. 30 distinct tribal sovereigns in the basin, you know, geographically, culturally, beautiful, beautiful people. And we spent time talking about, you know, why we need to be a part of this conversation as a people in terms of our spiritual connection, and also the reality of tribal water rights in the basin. 25% of the volume of the Colorado River is tribal water rights. And Right now, again, I'll say it again, in 2022, we don't have any ability to participate in the policy conversation because there's nowhere to do that. There's never been a place identified to do that. And so when we talk about the compact, I'll read this. It says, nothing in this compact shall be construed as affecting the obligations of the United States of America to Indian tribes. And so that's the foundational law of the river. It says it doesn't apply to us. But over the last 100 years, before the settlement process started, there was 100 years of established policy. And guess what? That's where tribes are at right now. My tribe settled its water rights in '92, so we're just barely getting up to speed and focusing all this attention on water policy because of the level of importance it is to us, and not having any place and having to create our own capacity because that wasn't available to us. And so we've done that through the 10 Tribes Partnership, organizations like Intertribal Council of Arizona, and now the Water and Tribes Initiative, kind of hopefully trying to build consensus on a broader conversation, because those conversations and those structural places for us to engage in those conversations just didn't exist. And so, and most of these water rights are senior water rights. And it's really important to understand too that in 1922, my tribe was living on subsistence rations on my newly established reservation. We didn't adopt the formal governance structure until 1934 in the Indian Reorganization Act. So, we were never a part of this conversation to begin with. And so when we start to think about this, I was, thinking about, what am I going to say? And so Eric talked about bonus water. With tribal water rights being this gray area in the basin, there's been this unused tribal entitlement, of at least 500,000 acre-feet in the upper basin. And we had a similar amount before DCP in the lower basin as well, but those tribes got to participate to a large degree in that process. And so, we have a situation where, the basin study acknowledged that there's 3.4 million acre-feet of water rights in the basin. So I'll use Overpeck and Udall's number of, I believe it was 10.6. And if you subtract, that 25%, 3.4 million acres off the top of that estimated 10.6 million acre feet, you're left with 5.7 million acre feet. And then if you take the 70% of ag, you get 4 million acre feet, which leaves the rest of the basin 2.7 million acre feet to apportion. And so, I really want to have folks start looking at it through that lens because, tribal water rights can no longer be a gray area. We can't afford it in any shape or form. And so when we talk about, Amy talked a little bit about, well, how do we determine equity? We weren't a part of the equity conversation, and absolutely understand that in 1922, the values were completely different than they are today. And so in order to have an equity conversation, you need to have inclusion. And so inclusion of, a race of individuals that have been here for thousands of years, who have ownership to 25% of the river, really seems to make sense to me. And we're talking about the current situation right now. It absolutely makes sense because, to stop the institutional theft of tribal water, because it continues to happen. And you can't tell me that the federal government doesn't understand that we have this unused entitlement. And so we have tribes who haven't had the luxury of even developing water rights because of the law of the river. And so when you talk, Secretary Trujillo talked about the settlement process. That's really great in terms of, well, we're thinking about that, but where are you going to get the water for future settlements? And how are you going to address the inability for tribes to develop their current water rights? And so if we're going to create something different, yeah, we've got to be inclusive of those values that weren't included in the 1922 conversations about how we equitably apportion, the water from the Colorado River. And tribes for the last 10 years have been telling the broader basin about, we will lead from a spiritual mandate to ensure that water is available for all living creatures in the basin. They've been saying that, I mean, wanting to be a part of this process. They've been telling you that we want to share the risk, but we want to know what that risk is. We can't share that risk until we identify and clarify and include tribal water rights in this conversation. And so one of the things that, that absolutely is changing now, and I give credit to tribes, and then those partners that help to empower the conversation of collaboration. I'm very, very privileged to be a part of the Water and Tribes Initiative. Our agenda is twofold: help enhance and build tribal capacity, and next is to build on the collaborative efforts that had already started to be engaged in the basin, when I got involved a long time ago. Those partnerships and relationships are actively working right now. Tribes are part of those conversations and really seeing that we have to do this ourselves because we can't rely on our basin states and the federal government because it hasn't been done up to this point. And it's really great to talk about, things are getting better, but we need transformation. I mean, we heard the talk this morning. And for me, thinking about, this exclusion of tribal sovereigns and not having them have parity to state sovereigns just has to stop. We need the ability to speak for our own water rights. We just went through, and we continue to go through a pandemic that absolutely highlighted, because our water rights weren't clarified at the state, federal level, a lot of my people died. Some didn't even have access to running water in their houses. And so, yes, this is a tipping point for tribes, and absolutely, to the extent that they can, because it affects all areas of tribal governance too. A lot of tribes are farmers as well. So we're part of all these conversations, but a lot of these tribes don't have capacity to engage in it, as much as they would like to. And so I ask, the collective basin, this has to be a collaborative effort, but it needs to acknowledge, the tribal sovereigns. And if we acknowledge that, then we can actually, start to be able to utilize our own, traditional and cultural knowledge about the environment. Because right now it makes it really tough to do given the current environment. So, thank you.
Thanks much. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I get to have you back here, and then we'll have questions for you about how we're going to resolve this. So we have another hour to resolve all the problems that you all have laid out. So there should be plenty of time. Lunch is upstairs, one floor up, and we need to be back here at 1:15. Do I have that right, Sean? Thank you much, all.
I'm not sure it helped or hurt.
Folks, if we could take our seats and get ready. I see some really important conversations. So if you're in the middle of collaborative governance and solving the basin's problems, do continue, but outside. Appreciate it. Thanks. I appreciate your return for the second part of this strange bifurcated panel. And I realized I didn't really do introductions. They're in your programs, but it's important to remember that we have, I think, a little bit of an unbalanced panel. We have four folks from the upper basin and one from the lower basin. Sorry. But as the moderator, I consider myself a neutral all basin player. So we were talking before the break about the challenges of squaring the language of the compact with the hydrologic realities in the way in which in the past we have resolved the uncertainties by just letting a whole bunch of people use more water, sometimes at the expense of other people in the basin. And in the conversation, I think I heard all four of you raise different versions of the question of, and principle of equity, which is, in theory at the heart of the compact. We have an upper basin that feels an inequity because the compact appears by one interpretation that is common to place the burden of climate change on the upper basin. We heard Daryl talk about the inequities of tribal communities, which were given an unrepresented nod in the compact and then ignored for the better part of the century that we've been using the compact to develop water. We heard Arizona with the question of the junior status of the Central Arizona Project, which makes it, in a sense, extremely vulnerable to the hydrologic changes. And I want to refer back to something incredibly insightful and important that I heard Brad Udall actually say, I think here in the summer of 2015, which is we can have a bunch of really sophisticated, smarty pants legal thinking about what the compact means, but if it forces us into communities, into situations that treat communities in this basin in a way that kind of feels unfair to all of us and to the broader public, that sense of fairness matters, and in a way that no legal angels dancing on the head of a pin analysis can escape the reality of the fairness. And so I want to start by asking all of you for a conversation, for your own ideas about what equity actually should mean going forward, given that we maybe don't have the water that the compact, well, we don't have the water the compact authors thought we had. Any one of you. What does equity mean to you?
Well, I can say to me, what it doesn't mean, it's not 50-50. An equitable apportionment, in my crude view of it, is that it was whatever could be sold at home. That became equitable in terms of these compact negotiations. The other thing I want to point out is the purpose of the compact and mini compacts is the equitable division of the use of waters of an interstate stream. Well, division is a mathematical concept. So at some point, we're not going to get away from numbers. Now, those numbers may be percentages. Those numbers can vary based on how much water we have. There's lots of different ways we can use numbers, but ultimately, it's going to be about numbers. And I think the reality is this equity, we know what it's not. What it is simply an agreement that everybody can live with.
Yeah, I want to echo Eric's sentiment about, equity doesn't necessarily mean 50-50. When my kids were little, and I would bring home a pair of cleats for one of them, the other would inevitably say, well, wait a second, why is he getting cleats? I'm not, I want cleats, I need cleats. It's like, no, you really don't need cleats. And the whole principle was, same is not necessarily equal, right? You'll all get what you need, but you don't need cleats now. You'll probably need cleats later when he doesn't need cleats, right? And I think it's the same, to use a very pedantic example, I think it's the same on this river. I mean, if you take the language of the compact, Article 3, and you look at the 75/10 or non-depletion obligation, if, other alternative theories don't apply, and I'm just gonna, for the moment, talk about the shall not cause the flows to be depleted, because I think that there are some some of us who wonder if climate change should really be factored into that mix. But, how is this equitable? How does this affect an equitable division and apportionment under Article 1 to have an absolute obligation imposed on the upper basin, especially in light of the hydrology? And then, kind of going back to Eric's point, how does that square with current basin-wide use? How does equity and division square with that? I mean, recent provisional estimates by the Bureau and the UCRC based on the last year's use, so this is water year 2021, show that the lower basin in Mexico are using roughly 10 million acre feet per annum. And I want to say depletions of roughly 10 million acre feet per annum. And the upper division states are using about 3.5 million acre feet per annum. And Reclamation just released a provisional natural flow estimate for 2021, I think of 6.7, right? It's like Daryl pointed out earlier, do the math. This is not working out. So how do we square the concept of equity based on reality, existing uses, and God forbid we end up in front of SCOTUS or some other, we lose control over the discussion and we submit to folks that do not have the bench of knowledge that this group has. I mean, that would be my fear.
Yeah, I guess I'll go. Thanks, Amy. I think it's really important to still understand that, for tribes, current water, I mean, where we're at right now in the policy conversation, tribal engagement in the policy conversation is on top of 100 years of existing policy that had already been built. And you guys heard me say a lot over the last 10 years, if you know one tribe, you know one tribe. Well, if you know one settlement or one decree, then you know one settlement and one decree, because each one of them is different in how they're structured, how they're created, what their intent was. And so understanding that for tribes, it's like we're just beginning to get into it because we weren't a part of it for the last 100 years. My experience has been, the conversation was so siloed, even as early as just 10 years ago, in terms of the divisions we had created, states, feds, ag, tribes, and others. And that's how we operated, that's how we communicated. And there was a whole lot of talk about the protecting of the status quo in terms of, those who had the ability to fully develop and utilize water rights. And I really appreciate, I think it was John Hensteminger who talked about the luxury of being able to develop water rights or something to that effect. Sorry if I misquoted you, John. But, because of the fact that our settlements, our water rights settlements and decrees are so young, we haven't had the real ability because we're behind in all areas of tribal governance as well, usually. And so understanding that this is just one component of that and our ability, to be able to responsibly engage, is based on all that previous history. And so when we talk about, equity and inclusion, absolutely for me is based in a recognition of tribal sovereignty and self-determination, and at least on parity with state sovereigns. And what does that do? It absolutely starts to set a foundation of an acknowledgement of who we are in this country as indigenous folks. And it helps us to start to be able to start those mechanisms of being able to reconcile an unreconciled past for us. And we need your help to help us reconcile that past, because on most Indian reservations, that unreconciled past leads to an inability to create a future for yourselves. And so when we talk about, at the heart of this, equity and inclusion, we've been having this conversation in the indigenous world for a long, long time. And now we're having it on a broader basis because water has brought us here to talk about what equity and inclusion looks like. And those conversations of who determines equity, and for us, again, kind of coming from what I know, the spiritual perspective, the Creator determines equity in our minds to a large from places that I'm from. And if that's the case, then this is something that needs to be built collectively. And part of equity is absolutely inclusion. And only until very recently have we started to be included in these conversations. And remember, I go back to, again, I'll say it over and over again until I don't have to, there's no place for tribes to engage in the the water policy conversation in the Colorado River Basin formally. You know, we hear about tribal engagement and about tribal participation, but there's never been a declarative statement that says, we will make that place for you. We will provide that place for you that you can engage in. And that's what equity and inclusion looks like to me.
Just as I used to tell my kids, life's not fair, we're not going to have that argument when they felt that I had been unjust. I would suggest, I'm very moved, Daryl, and always am when I hear you and I see it, that the failure to develop, the failure by the collective to work to fully realize tribal water rights has been a huge factor in holding back tribal communities. And there's a big responsibility to address that. I think we should move the conversation off equity and move it onto an honest conversation about need and be thinking about what are the needs. And it feels scary when you're thinking that there will be no water delivered to Central Arizona. That's a scary thought. It's scary to think that Yuma wouldn't have any water. That's a terrible idea, and it would be more productive for us to be thinking collectively about what are the needs. Also, I'm pretty sure you all don't want everybody in Phoenix to pick up stakes and move to your town. So why can't we be having a conversation about what are the real needs and how do we do what we need to do? And there's probably a big opportunity for investments to make some big water users whole. I've had interesting conversations with some of my Arizona friends about investments in the Salton Sea to make it easier for Imperial to participate in discussions. So part of the solution here is beyond how do we split the water, and it's how do we come up with the funding that would help people use less water.
So how do we split sort of our understanding of the needs and the problems and share those? I mean, certainly with respect to the Salton Sea, there's been a long-standing discussion on the part of a lot of people across the basin to fence that off as a California problem and to not do what you just suggested. Eric really nicely couched this in terms of the tripwire and had some really interesting discussions during the break, and there have been others about whether the tripwire even matters anymore. We're heading toward a situation where we may have to be using the outlet tubes on Glen Canyon Dam, which can only move 7 million acre feet, and so none of this may matter at all. Do we need to avoid the tripwire, or do we need to engage with the questions arrival at the tripwire presents to us? I mean, and this goes to this deeper question, like, does compact matter at all anymore? Like, I was thinking about that as I watched Commissioner Tooten's testimony. It's like, I don't know, this is a new world we're in.
It's kind of like the Saturday Night Live, The Question is Moot game show, remember that? I think that's what we have here. The tripwire isn't in the thinking right now because things are so bad.
It's amazing how much things have changed since we started planning these panels.
And I thought the tripwire in DROA was 35-25. I mean, where was I? So I think, we've got several tripwires that we've been grappling with.
And I feel like I've been tripping the last 12 years.
We crossed your tripwire a long time ago.
I mean that by stumbling, not like.
The other kind of tripping. We are a weird panel, aren't we?
I mean, Eric, is the compact still relevant? Does the tripwire matter?
Well, the compact is still relevant because it is the reason we have meetings like this. It represents the collective effort to continue to talk. I think that's the primary relevance of the compact. Are some of the numbers in the compact still relevant? Yeah, hopefully not. But then one of my concerns is that left to the water community, left to the professionals, left to the assuming a tribal engagement that works for their needs, and assuming that the kind of people that we have in this room and the kind of people that the agencies employ, I think they can get the job done. But I worry, quite frankly, about the pressure they're going to have from others. You know, working for a board for 30 years, you know, board pressures are very different. And we don't know who's going to be the next governor of Arizona. We don't know who's going to be the next, you know, director of the Department of Water Resources in Arizona. We don't know who's going to be the next governor of Wyoming or Colorado or New Mexico or Nevada. And my concern is that the people who can solve these problems because they know how to do it are going to be pushed aside, and things like the equity argument, or we have an absolute right to develop 7.5 million acre feet, you know, that kind of language will prevail and will sidetrack us.
And I would say those arguments are very active and in effect, you know, and they've been used to deflect and delude, you know, kind of the situation for whatever agenda, you know, organization may have or entity may have. And I think we're all at that point. We were having that conversation earlier about, like, you know, we all know each other's hand, and you guys have heard me say that before too. I mean, there's not a whole lot of mystery left in the Colorado River, except the human mystery about how we're going to do this together.
I would love to hear, where is Sean? Pass around the microphone. Do we have questions? Questions from Pat's? I think that was that Pat? My glasses aren't good.
Where are we going here, John? Where am I going?
Pat, raise your hand, Pat.
Oh, lots of hands.
In the back.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate being here. This is my third year here, and I know many of you, and you know, I'm not saying that agriculture doesn't have a voice, because we do, and I had the opportunity recently to use my voice. But what I am troubled about in the big discussion is, you know, I'm a rancher and a farmer, and I produce food, and everybody knows that. But I also work on biodiversity. I went to the Glasgow meetings, you know, on climate. And I look at these meetings, and there just seems to be not a realization of a couple things that are important. One, never talk about growth. We never talk about growth at these meetings that I've been aware of. The cities are given a lot of time to talk about the conservation methods that they're starting to implement, which is crucial. My own personal view is they've been building reserves for 30 years. So they've got a generation of conservation to do before, you know, we start looking at how do we undermine the, you know, the crisis in food production. But when you look at some, you know, virtually all of the, what I call the unsustainable megalopolises, they're looking to double. So the numbers of acre feet that they need now is really, you have to put it in the context of what happens when they double, which is what they are on track to do. And then what are the implications, not just on food, but on biodiversity, you know, and I think that there's a carbon discussion on climate that we all are having, but really, to me, it's a climate, biodiversity, water discussion. And so at the expense of that part of it, you know, how do we start having a discussion about what growth means to the basin? You know, and I try to be like Daryl, you know, I use my mind, but I speak from my heart. And those of us that have the water rights that are so easily criticized, thank God they love the land, because that's what's the driver for them. It's not about making money, and it's not about a whole lot of other things, but you read the LA Times and the New York Times, and it seems like we ought to have a war against the people that have barns in their yards. You know, I had an opportunity, as I said, to talk, and I appreciate you letting me talk on a little bit here, but there were some words that are starting to be used about what kind of crops farmers should have and repurposing land away from agriculture that get to us at the heart level. And those are now the new discussions we're going to have about how we justify taking the water. So I guess just my question and my perspective is how do we, at the very least, understand the implications of the growth and what it will mean to the rest of the system? So thank you.
I spent a week at an ag conference in Idaho that was most enlightening and wonderful. But when I finally got a chance to say something, I said, I want to disabuse you of two myths. And one is that no one has any business farming in the desert. And the second is that the cities are using up all the water. In the 3-county service area that the CAP serves, Phoenix to Tucson, in the last 20 years, there was 45% growth in population. There was a 14% increase in water demand. And it could have been a 0% increase had there been a more rigorous regime around water demand. It's just that at the time, especially for the first 10 years or so of that growth, there wasn't. Cities are able to decouple to a great, there's a lot of room, a long runway for cities to continue to grow, to have bigger economies and much bigger populations without a correlated increase in water demand. Does that mean that cities are off the hook? No, people in cities should be contributing by conserving as they can and making smart choices about water resilient economic development and water resilient population development. But urban development, at least I can speak for Central Arizona, isn't the problem. And the amount of water that cities use in Arizona, the M&I sector, if we cut it by half, we would save 250,000 acre feet. If we cut it by 50%, that isn't going to make a big dent in the 2 to 4 million acre foot challenge that we're now facing. So I think it's important to really look at what is the role of cities and water demand in this basin.
So let me tug this back to the compact, because I think Pat's question raises really an important question about the compact. And this is something that's become a lot more clear to me in recent years, writing with Eric about the history of the compact. When that document was written, the notion largely that there would be large-scale municipalities and urban use of that water was just not in their thinking. It is a document that was written to ensure the availability of water for agriculture. And we have communities all across the basin who grew up around that promise, making good faith investments in building their lives. And it's really important to recognize who was left out of that, right? I mean, that's a piece of this. The compact promised some people that water, and we have an unrealized promise to some people. But how do we move forward in a world that's very different, where the West has become urban, and square that with the way the compact doled out the water and left to individual states the decision about how to do the allocation within their states?
And I would just say, John and Pat, yeah, and I totally agree with Pat about, the agriculture conversation. And part of the reason I have interest in it is because, as been mentioned before, on my Pueblo side, we've been farming in this region for thousands of years. And so tribes and pueblos and nations are farmers as well. And we have been, that's how we lived. And so when we think about the ag conversation, it's the diversity of it from IID to mom and pop on the western slope. Is one more important than the other? No, just like larger tribes, smaller tribes. I mean, And I think, Pat raises a really great question in terms of, for me, we have the opportunity in terms of policy should be adaptive and not restrictive. And because current policy doesn't allow for future thinking, it operates within the confines of what exists right now. So I would assert there's no future under the current structure at all, and that it needs to be developed. And one of the, I just want to, in ag being over 70% of the water in the basin, I know it's probably more than that, but absolutely we need to have this conversation because it's such a diverse community. And you have to include tribes, nations, and pueblos in this conversation because they're impacted as well because they've been farmers for thousands of years. And they want to continue their existence and their way of life. And then the last thing I wanted to just say is that I wanted to share, with people who have that connection to the land, who understand that, who become farmers in the West, and those non-Indigenous farmers who've developed that sense of the earth. I just ask that you understand what price was paid for you to have that sense of connection to the land. And because that came at a price. And you have that connection to the land now, but imagine amplifying that connection to the land by thousands of years. And so that's what we have that in common now in terms of that connection to land, but understand the price that needed to be paid for you to have that opportunity.
I'm going to pull on a thread a little bit here that Daryl, raised in terms of adaptive. Lawyers call this a frolic or a detour, so I'm going to take a little frolic or detour around Daryl's comment. I think many of us can agree that the compact is not adaptive in a way that we would like it to be. My concern is as we talk about the post-2026 operational criteria for this river, or even these near-term emergencies, we're falling into those same traps, right? There's this notion out there that we are going to see an 11 million acre foot natural flow. We kind of gravitate around these numbers or reservoir elevations. That's the old model. That's the old school model, right? We have got to get away from a single hydrology or a single elevation and really put our energy toward coming back to the table and responding to conditions as they emerge. I think as long as we take that attitude and we revert back to, well, it's comfortable to talk about a single volume or a single hydrology, we're stuck. I mean, this next panel is going to talk about that. Pick your natural flow, pick your number. When we start, and I appreciate the Assistant Secretary talking about reductions on the order of 2 and 4 million acre feet, not being prescriptive about that, kind of leaving it up to the basin to decide, but we've got to get away from these short-term fixes. We've got to get away from these Band-Aids. This is not adaptive, it's not adaptable, but it's a temptation, and I think we've seen it for the last 100 years, and we've seen it manifest in the 07 guidelines and the DCPs and in these short-term operations.
So sketch out what your alternative management paradigm would look like.
So, and again, I'm a non-technical person channeling my inner hydrologist or engineer, so this is always a very scary proposition, but why don't we just account for this basin as a basin, right? I mean, this whole idea that it's heretical to talk about ICS accounts in Lake Powell, fine, let's talk about them. And let's talk about a bonus water account in Lake Mead where the lower basin draws from that account before we start, or keep rather, releasing water from Glen Canyon. I mean, we can be parochial about this. Maybe we push the compact to its outer limits, but I think we've got to deal with the system as a system. Another piece of this, and again, no silver bullets here, but we talk about in the upper basin, a development cap is anathema, right? We don't talk about that because we've underdeveloped, right? And that really could potentially prejudice any one of the upper division states if we have good hydrology, right? That's not something I think the states are willing to concede. Well, then let's talk about it differently. Let's talk about sharing shortage as between the basins, right? Not divvying up a natural flow every year on the river, if we can even make that determination. Again, it goes to the same is not equal, right? Okay, here's the shortage upper basin. This is what you've developed. Here's the shortage lower basin. You figure it out. I mean,
so key in on a year-to-year basis or a couple of year basis on what the actual hydrology is and managing to the actual hydrology.
And it's tough. I mean, I don't think it means that we have to come back to the table more regularly and have these hard discussions. But I think we fall into the traps of these, reservoir. I mean, look at what happened in the 07 guidelines, right? There was a perverse incentive to maximize the disparity in elevations between Meade and Powell. That doesn't work. If you're talking about managing a system, that's not managing the system, right? That creates these perverse incentives because we're dealing with fixed elevations. I think the same is true for volumes, right? You gravitate to one volume and guess what? 3 years later, it's irrelevant. Anyhow, off my soapbox.
I'm wondering, the Upper Colorado River Basin Compact portioned the water based on a percentage. They did this with some foresight, understanding that a number was almost impossible to come up with. The Rio Grande Compact, it's a little more complicated and weird. I like this panel, but anyway, it apportions water, based on the amount that's available. Pecos River Compact. So there are models out there, and I think at some point in time on a river that is subject to deep uncertainty caused by climate change, we're going to have to talk about getting rid of fixed numbers. We're going to deal with numbers, but let's get rid of fixed numbers and start talking about apportioning water based on what's there, not what we thought was there, 50 or 100 years ago.
And I would just add to what Amy said in terms of this conversation about a whole of basin approach. It doesn't make sense to me that we have two different governance systems in upper and lower basin. With 7 basin states, 40 plus million people, 30 tribal sovereigns, to have this governance system that isn't a whole of a basin approach doesn't make any sense anymore. I don't know if it ever made any sense in terms of the upper basin, lower basin divide. I guess it did because of the dams. But now just in terms of urgency and efficiency, there's got to be this whole of basin approach. And to be thinking longer term in terms of what does that look like in terms of a management structure, considering those sovereigns that are involved and stakeholders that are involved.
We have an audience question. Is Sean around with the microphone?
Michael.
Sean, wait for the mic here. Sean. Michael.
So if you were an ivory tower economist, you'd say you divide it up on percentages, and you have percentages. And Australia did that with the Murray-Darling Basin. And they have a different legal regime, so they could make changes 20 years ago that we can't. But my Australian friends tell me that a consequence of this has been that every stakeholder bears risk. The environmental groups own percentages of the flow, as do farmers in various parts of the basin. And every single water user under this percentage allocation has an incentive to find insurance, to make investments, to save water, to spend money. But it gives everybody an incentive. And having dealt with water reliability in Southern California over the last year, MET acts as though it has no risk. At least it didn't act that way until Tuesday. And so I do think it's an important byproduct of using percentage allocation of the whole basin, that everybody knows he, she, or it is at risk and will change. I'd like to make one other comment quickly about Indian water rights. So I've worked with the Hopi tribe for 19 years on their water rights trial. And a month ago, the judge cast aside our proposal for a right for ceremonial and subsistence use of water. And she recognized an ag right and a DCMA right, but no subsistence. But I just want to say one thing. Part of the terrible problems on Indian reservations are the plumbing, not the water rights. The water systems were, in most cases, or many cases, financed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the 50s and 60s to standards that Britain used in India and its colonies before and just after World War II. The pipes are way thin. They're not designed for population growth. They're not designed for any commercial use. And so another date is 1908. And the failure to really live up as a country to the obligation assumed in the Windows. And in the Middle East, you know, there have been discussions between Israel and Palestine and Jordan. It's not just about dividing water, it's that money in some cases is a substitute for water. And there needs to be a real infrastructure funding for Native American reservations to provide both the pipe system in the villages, but also the aqueducts or whatever, the conveyance. And that should be handled, and that really is a financial obligation. And to some extent, it should be taking care of that. There's still the issue of dividing up water. But you shouldn't see everything as dividing up water, because this is really financing infrastructure for a human right to live.
Peter.
And just real quickly, I co-facilitate the Water and Tribes Initiative, and through, I don't see her here, oh, there she is, Ann Castle and Bitta Becker, we did a universal access to clean water project that was really driven by some of the craziness of COVID and how, through analysis and research that Ann and Bitta and Heather Tanana from the University of Utah just found out, all of these infrastructures projects that still hadn't been completed yet for whatever reason. And then you have a state, that's next to us that won't provide basic infrastructure on Indian reservations until there's a settlement in place. That's unconscionable, because access to clean water should be a right of every citizen in this United States, whether or not, whatever ethnicity you are. And I just wanted to respond to one thing, because you hit on something that I think is really important when we start to imagine the future of the basin, is scales of economy. And they're going to be driven by inclusion, and they'll determine, and they'll be determined by the kind of the joint values that are established. Because if you look at water valuation right now, it's all over the board. And so we can't even, there's not even a basis to having a conversation about what is the value of water, and what are we going to collectively give as a group of people in the basin, what value will we assign to that? And that'll, again, determine our actions.
So I'm interested what the panel thinks about whether or not the language of the compact actually really matters anymore, or it's just the existence of the compact on the other side of the compact is the Supreme Court of the United States, and that's what causes us to be here at this conference and causes all of the conversations that have to go forward to figure out how to solve this problem.
I think what matters is the fact that we signed the compact, and that presented, or that was a commitment to continue to talk in the future. We're not going to get away from all numbers, like I said, but I think the existence of the compact is in fact more important than what's actually in it.
I think that we heard this week that the federal government is going to do what has to be done. And arguably, the compact, maybe the fine points of the compact won't be a big part of the decision about what has to be done because this is an emergency situation. I do want to push back on the idea that the compact, that we need to throw it off. It actually has been pretty adaptive. And when you think that the people who signed the compact never contemplated big metropolitan areas, probably never contemplated tribal water settlements. So much has happened. So many very creative partnerships have occurred. The 07 guidelines, the DCP, upper and lower. There has been a lot of very creative adaptation within the four corners of the compact, and a few other things like my favorite, Arizona versus California, that really has proven that the compact was a great framework for water management for a century. Is it perfect? No. Did it contemplate climate change? It certainly didn't, but it has been pretty robust. And we mustn't forget that this is all about economic security. Water certainty is all about people being able to know how they can live their lives, where it makes sense to make investments. Does it make sense to have a farm or a business or a city? All of those things, or a habitat. We need to be careful of change, of radical change, because the ramifications there can be unintended consequences. So I'm team compact and incremental transformation, and I think we can get there.
I was off the clock, so I turned my mic off here. I agree with Sarah and I agree with Eric, and I think that one of the fundamental things about the 22 Compact is it does bring us back to the table. We've been honing in on this concept, I at least, under Article 1 of the Compact around equity. But let us not forget, Article 1 also says that we're trying to promote interstate comity and remove causes of present and future controversies. And I think that the nuclear option for us is if we relinquish control to a body like the High Court. I have been an attorney of record in an original action, and it's not a redeeming place to be. If the beauty of the 22 Compact is to keep us talking, all of us that have an interest, then I think that there's some merit there.
I would just add, John, like I said earlier, Article 7 says it doesn't apply to tribes. And so my tribe has always operated from that premise. So anything after that, becomes really, I become team compact by default because that's what exists. And so there was a tribe, it was interesting because we went through this exercise who wanted inclusion into the Upper Colorado River Commission a few years back. And it sparked a very interesting conversation within the tribal community on the Colorado River, because if you're asking for inclusion into that organization, then you're saying that it applies to you. And so we were very, very, very careful about that. And so about walking that little knife edge, if you will. And one of the other things that's really important to understand for tribes right now too is that, our only recourse, because we don't have any place to engage in policy, is to litigate. That's been our only option. And so can you imagine that being your only option and with this Supreme Court makeup? You have to take your chances. And so definitely, we're aware of that as well in terms of if this thing goes into a direction where we're fighting in the courts, the river's dead. And so, definitely something that we're not interested in pursuing because it's not a very good pathway at this point in time. So we have to, try to make the effort to create these relationships and partnerships. And I just wanted to make sure that we touched on that because there's a huge, huge movement in the basin now in terms of these partnerships that are effective and working together to actually move something outside the structure.
We've got just a little more time. Do I have any? Kevin, raise hand so Sean can see.
So I've been thinking a lot about constructive ambiguity in the compact, and to what extent it was they got around a lot of the challenges by integrating ambiguity. And of course, in the 44 treaty, I think there's far less ambiguity in there. There's some the drought clause. I'd be curious if you say, for example, you're advising on a new treaty with a few countries, the value of constructive ambiguity, is this a good thing to do? And in the context, of course, I'm working on in other basins in the world, we're trying to decide whether constructive ambiguity is a good thing to do or not.
Do you like litigation?
But if it's international.
It's good for lawyers.
No, so international river basins where there's really no agreement.
Still have an opportunity.
if they agree to the international courts.
You know, I actually think some ambiguity gives you some options as long as there's a mechanism in the treaty or compact that when that ambiguity comes out, you can deal with it. The best example of that is the minutes in the 1944 treaty. Can you imagine how we would be dealing with the river if we didn't have the opportunity to have minutes? You know, so that example, I think, is a way to go. Look at how we administer, and as I understand it, the fact that there are minutes is sort of like not a mistake, but it was more dealing with the boundaries than it was in the river, than it was the water itself. But we took advantage of it, right?
But is there ambiguity just because inevitably circumstances change? I mean, we're talking about water supplies on a large scale, and that there's always going to be ambiguity.
I'm gonna disagree with Sarah on this point. I actually think that by virtue of some constructive ambiguity in the 22 compact and the implications of resolving some of these issues is a disincentive to litigate. I mean, the Mexican deficiency is, I think, a good example of that, right? I think my predecessor at the UCRC, Don Osler, referred to resolving the Mexican deficiency would be the mother of all lawsuits, right? And so that was almost a disincentive to have to litigate these issues and you know, defer them to another day. Well, I think that day is quickly arriving, right? Because we've had the luxury of hydrology and so forth. But I do think there's there might be a reason to have reasonable, another legal word, constructive ambiguity in some of these agreements, so that you can adapt. I mean, it goes back to this whole adaptability concept that's so easy to say, but so hard in practice.
So we've got time. I'll again use my prerogative to ask the final question. We have just a few minutes, and I want to hear from all of you on this question. Given the set of challenges that we have been describing, I wanted this to now be personal for each of you. What do you think your community, the community you live in, and I'll let you, several people here have several communities of identity geographically. What's your community, what will be different? What will your community look like if we successfully resolve all these questions in 10, 20 years? What will be different about our West? You guys want me to go first?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. This is a question I've been thinking a lot about. I teach a class, graduate students in the Water Resources program at the University of New Mexico, and we try to get them to think about this question. And the question is, there's less water, what do we do? And the students start by trying to assign more water to their preferred use, often environmental flows, or their community, or their preference is local food production. And my own personal answer to all of this is all of it will be less green. There will be less water for trees in our yards. There will be less water for irrigated agriculture in the valley that I live in. There may very well be no water. We've seen no will in our community to put water in a flowing river, and I don't, much as that saddens me and pains me, I don't see that changing. So that's my answer for Albuquerque, New Mexico, my community.
Yeah, oh, go ahead. Sure. Well, I would say less, those things in central Arizona for sure. My community is Phoenix, and there's room, there's there's some give for people to reduce their water use, and of course we have a tension with urban heat island that we have to balance, but we can grow more dense and use less water and still have a cooler city. And there is some agriculture that won't, it won't be able to go on. And it starts with agriculture that's turning to mining groundwater now, which is really unfortunate, not a good thing for anybody. And then there probably won't be as much water available for agriculture in the future. So, but my hope would be that we can protect some of the agriculture that's occurring, the irrigated agriculture that's occurring in some warm places in the lower basin, because those places do make an important contribution to the national nutrition equation. And once they're out of production, it's unlikely that they could ever go back in.
I would just say, I live in Dulce, New Mexico, which is 3 miles south of the Colorado, New Mexico border on the Hickory Apache Reservation. And, our settlement includes, provides that our water is delivered to 2 storage facilities, one 25 miles away from the reservation, one about 45 miles away. We're looking to have, to create certainty in our ability to develop those water rights, because we can't utilize those rights on the reservation. And until we have certainty about how that's going to happen, we're affected economically, socially, culturally, in a lot of different ways. And so if we had certainty about what we could do, and had equity in terms of the opportunities to develop our water rights, like non-indigenous water folks do, then we would have an ability to actually plan for a future. And because right now we can't do that. And how will we proceed? Well, we'll proceed like we always done. We'll do with less, and we'll live within our means.
So, punch Eric. So I'm going to take kind of a glass half full approach here in terms of what the future may look like. And, I think that if this increases awareness about the value of water, that may not be a bad thing. I mean, you ask some folks in the West where their water comes from, and they say, yeah, the tap comes from the tap. So, I mean, if we can create generational awareness around the value of water and how precious it is, to use a tired adage, because it truly is precious, then maybe that's not a bad thing. And I think scarcity forces some of this. And I think that to the extent that people will become informed and educated about the resources, that's not a bad thing.
I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian. I'm going to basically say that I hope that based on what Jeff Lukas showed us, that decarbonization is more effective than we're planning. And that we, maybe not my grandkids, but their kids might have a river that looked substantially like it did a few years ago. So, because, it really does come back to dealing with the causes of climate change, and can we slow that down, and can we put some more certainty into the system by decarbonizing the economy.
Thanks much, all of you. I appreciate the audience. And yeah.